Welcome to the China Finance Forum, bringing together international experts and practitioners to discuss the macroeconomic, geopolitical and regulatory environment in which the global investment industry is operating.
Ladies and gentlemen, warm welcome to this 7th edition of the China Finance Forum. My name is Judith Bogner, and once again, it's my honor and my pleasure to lead you through this digital event on behalf of Luxembourg for Finance. As ever, I would like to express our gratitude to all our sponsors and our media partner, as well as to our 16 moderators and speakers who set aside time to join us and share their insights on China finance with us. And we thank all of you who are joining us from around the world, from some 22 countries. Of course, this event will be recorded for you and made available to you right here where you are watching the stream on the website of Luxembourg for Finance. Now, since we kicked off the China Finance Forum back in 2014 under its initial name, the Renminbi Forum, it's been truly awe-inspiring to witness China's journey to a sophisticated economic and financial powerhouse. As the globe's second largest economy with the second largest bond market and more than 1 billion internet users, China has increasingly deep impact on international value chains, on digital innovation, and of course capital markets. That said, this increasing global integration adds weight to China's leadership role and responsibility at the global stage, while at the same time exposing China's financial system and its economy more to global headwinds, such as those related to the Poli crisis. And so, over the next 3 hours, we will address all these dynamics and investigate what businesses, international investors, and financial services practitioners need to know about doing business in and with China. Dr. Bergsten from the Petersen Institute will give us his perspective on the geopolitical dynamics. This will be followed by a panel session on how global firms can navigate the changing landscape in China. Then HSBC's Frederic Neumann will give his outlook on the economic growth perspective of China and what drives this outlook. Then we'll have 2 panel sessions that will cover the latest investment trends, also in light of widening access channels for capital flows into and out of China, and of course also the growth of alternative investments in China and the Asian context. And then we'll round it up with a deep dive on China's digital economy, one of the largest in the world, and specifically Chinese e-commerce. And then we wrap it up with a look at how China is using green finance to support its transition to a low-carbon economy in alignment with the dual carbon policy of China. On that note, it's my very great pleasure to welcome to the China Finance Forum the Minister of Finance of Luxembourg, Her Excellency Yuriko. A warm welcome to you, Minister, and the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to speak to you today on the occasion of the annual China Finance Forum organized by Luxembourg for Finance. This year's forum also coincides with the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the People's Republic of China and Luxembourg, underlining the long-standing and excellent exchanges between our countries. At a moment when the world is dealing with a series of crises and rising geopolitical tensions, this forum, dedicated to better understanding the challenges of navigating China's market, couldn't be timelier. China is today the second largest economy in the world. The role of China has evolved significantly over the past decades, from the world's manufacturing hub to an upper middle-income country and one of the largest export markets for many countries across the globe. It is the 3rd largest export market for the US after its direct neighbors Mexico and Canada. It's the EU's 3rd largest market for the export of goods after the US and the UK. China is now a key growth and export market for sectors as diverse as US tech companies and investment banks, French and Italian luxury and consumer brands, and the German car industry. Last year, for example, 2 in 5 cars sold globally by Germany's largest car company were bought in China. By 2025, China is expected to account for nearly half of luxury goods and consumption in the world. Over the past decades, economic relations have also grown between China and Luxembourg, and not just in the financial sector. The steel industry, the automotive industry, the logistics sector, and more recently, Luxembourg's space sector have all developed significantly. Yet the current macroeconomic and geopolitical reality, marked by high levels of uncertainty, volatility, and tensions, also raises a number of new or additional challenges when it comes to trade and investment between China and the rest of the world. We are indeed today in a state of perma-crisis. The pandemic was followed by Russia's unjustifiable war in Ukraine, which has triggered a triple food, energy, and cost of living crisis. All the while, the climate crisis has lost none of its urgency. It is therefore important that we learn the right lessons from dealing with this perma-crisis. Given the growing complexity of our world, we need to go beyond simplistic solutions. This is, of course, also true when it comes to relations with China. I would therefore like to focus on the impact of this conglomeration of crises and the collective response to it. Let me start with the pandemic. The pandemic was a symmetric shock that hit nearly all countries in the world simultaneously, while the response to it diverged between countries and regions. The most obvious divergence here being China's continued zero-COVID policy, which also has an economic cost at home, and the gradual and today complete lifting of restrictions in the US and Europe. The pandemic has also been a stark reminder, if any was needed, of the interdependence of economies in the globalized world. It is fair to say that COVID tested the limits of globalization and exposed the number of weaknesses, especially in supply chains. For example, the fact that Europe did not have industrial capacity to produce its own supply of strategic sanitary equipment, such as surgical masks, is a vulnerability that must be addressed. Europe cannot afford to be exposed to similar shortfalls when the next pandemic or sanitary crisis hits. Onshoring or nearshoring of certain strategic activities, therefore, makes perfect sense. At the same time, the pandemic has also shown that Europe can come together and act in solidarity in times of need. The EU joint vaccine strategy, and notably the advanced purchase agreements with vaccine suppliers, as well as the creation of Next Generation EU as a common recovery fund focused on growth-enhancing investment in the green and digital transition, are perfect illustrations of this. However, the wrong lesson to draw from the sanitary crisis and the over-reliance on certain markets, including China, would be to conclude that we need a decoupling from other economies. There is today a worrying trend towards deglobalization and protectionism in Europe as elsewhere. It is therefore important to ensure that efforts to increase autonomy do not translate into widespread market and technology fragmentation. This is even more important at a time when supply chain disruption is already driving up inflation. Luxembourg therefore always insists on the open part of the EU's open strategic autonomy. Creating Fortress Europe would be in absolutely no one's interest, even less so as we are facing a potential recession in Europe. There is indeed a risk that Europe's open strategic autonomy, China's dual circulation strategy, which also aims to increase self-reliance, or Buy America rules in the US, lead to a collective decoupling of global markets and increased protectionism. Current tensions and responses to the ongoing crisis should not hide the fact that globalization has been a net positive, lifting billions of people out of poverty, spurring economic growth, lowering production costs, and ultimately the price of capital and consumer goods. Yet free trade is also not a free-for-all. Globalization needs a rules-based system, and companies need to take into account the social and environmental impact of their activities in different parts of the world. It also requires a level playing field when it comes to market access. This is today still not a given, certainly not when it comes to China, but also not in other parts of the world. This is why we need to ensure that there continues to be strong multilateral dialogue and exchange. This dialogue must include China, be it at a bilateral level with the EU and the US or in multilateral fora. This dialogue is key to ensure that the collective response to the crisis, as well as efforts focusing on self-reliance in areas ranging from semiconductors and batteries to surgical equipment, do not end in escalating tariffs and trade barriers between the world's economic blocs. This dialogue is also vital to address concerns around the environmental, social, and labor standards and seek convergence whenever possible. There are developments in China, for instance, in particular when it comes to human rights, which we cannot condone and that are not in line with our European values. It is absolutely clear to me that we cannot sacrifice our values on the altar of global trade. This is why it is all the more important to maintain a regular and frank exchange with China on multiple fronts and through multiple channels. A second topic I want to address is the war in Ukraine, which has long-term consequences far beyond Europe and requires a collective response. As it has done during the pandemic, the EU managed to come together quickly and decisively. The EU and its member states have provided direct support to Ukraine, both financially as well as materially, welcomed Ukrainians fleeing the war, and, together with international allies, have imposed the harshest sanctions packages in the EU's history. It is true that our own economies are also hit by these sanctions on Russia, but it is a price we must pay to stand with Ukraine and stand up for peace and our common European values. Russia is not only trying to hold Europe hostage over energy, it is also not shying away from doing the same with the most vulnerable countries in the world when it comes to food security. The war in Ukraine has caused a shifting of geopolitical fault lines and heightened tensions that had already emerged before. While we regret that China has not taken a similarly unequivocal stand on Russia's war of aggression or on the need for sanctions, China has an important role to play in helping to de-escalate this conflict, especially when it comes to avoiding the threat of using nuclear weapons. Again, the dialogue with China plays a crucial part in dealing with the war in Ukraine, but also its fallout, such as growing food crisis in developing countries. The tragic loss of human life caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, young soldiers on both lines, civilians and children, should be a lesson to all of us that there can be no place in the 21st century for the barbarism of the last century. As Europeans, we hope that the war in Ukraine serves as a deterrent for other countries, that military aggression is never the right solution. Finally, above and beyond these two epoch-making crises, climate change remains the most existential threat that humanity is facing. As a result of the war in Ukraine, the energy transition has today become inextricably linked to the issue of energy security. This is especially obvious in Europe, which over decades had become over-reliant on Russian oil and especially gas. In the short term, Europe has to look at alternative sources in order to become less dependent on Russian fossil fuels and fully meet its energy needs. And this shift is happening. But it is fair to say that the energy transition risks going off track in the immediate term as countries delay decommissioning polluting energy sources and even reactivating old coal plants to meet shortfalls. Nevertheless, I see a silver lining on two fronts. First, the current drive towards energy resilience and self-sufficiency will boost investments in renewables in the mid to long term, not just in Europe. Secondly, the current crisis is an opportunity to reconsider our economic models, especially when it comes to our energy consumption. Faced with today's crisis, energy savings and energy efficiency have taken on a new urgency. It is not merely enough to find new sources of energy. We collectively also need to consume less energy. This is an important lesson on our path to net zero. Electricity and heat are by far the largest sources of man-made greenhouse gas emissions, accounting for more than 30% of global emissions. This is more than the emissions of transportation, manufacturing, and construction put together. And the lion's share of these emissions on a per capita basis comes from the US, China, and the EU. This is another stark reminder that despite geopolitical tensions, the world's main economic blocs need to continue to cooperate to address the global climate crisis. In fact, without China on board, which accounts for around 30% of global emissions, we cannot address the climate crisis, nor can we achieve net zero. This is a collective effort. The same is true for related issues ranging from protecting biodiversity and marine life to ending hunger and to ending poverty. In order to address the key issues of our time, achieving sustainable growth across the global economy, de-escalating the war in Ukraine, and combating climate change, China, the US, and Europe need to work together. The reality is that China needs the rest of the world, and the rest of the world needs China. China is simply too large of an economy and far too interconnected with the world to contain or to isolate. This, of course, goes both ways. As we all know, with great power comes great responsibility. The choices that China makes today and tomorrow have an impact on the rest of the world. They will also shape its relations with the US and Europe for the decades to come.
Thank you, Minister Bacchus, for setting the stage for our conversations today with your keynote. And as Minister Bacchus said, strong multilateral dialogue is vital to work out those collective solutions for the many issues she raised that our world is facing. And our next keynote speaker, Dr. Bergsten, has dedicated his whole professional life to exactly this dialogue between Asia, the United States, and Europe. He's a non-resident senior fellow and director emeritus at the Petersen Institute for International Economics, of which he was the founding director from its creation in 1981 through to 2012 when he retired. Dr. Bergsten also has a distinguished diplomatic career in the US government. He was Assistant Secretary for International Affairs of the US Treasury between 1971 and 1977 and 81. He was also Assistant for International Economic Affairs to Dr. Henry Kissinger at the National Security Council, where he coordinated US foreign economic policy in the White House between 1969 and 71. He was appointed by President Obama to the Advisory Committee on Trade Policy and Negotiations in 2010 and 2014, and then again reappointed by President Trump in 2018. Dr. Bergsten also served as chair of the Competitiveness Policy Council, created by US Congress, from 1991 to 95, and simultaneously between 93 and 95, he also chaired the US ASEAN Forum Eminent Persons Group, which, if you will, channeled the aspirations for the creation of free and open trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific region, which became APEC as we know it today. Dr. Bergsten has poured his wealth of knowledge, wisdom, and experience in no less than 47 books on a wide range of international geopolitical and economic issues, including his latest book, The United States versus China, The Quest for Global Economic Leadership. And this is what he's going to address in his keynote for us today. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Bergsten, and the floor is yours.
Three-and-a-half-hour meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping in Bali around the G20 summit in Indonesia dramatically underlined the new global geopolitical context in which world finance is now being pursued. Despite the good noises coming out of Bali, I think it's fair to say that the US and China are on course toward a new Cold War. The confrontation and even potential conflict between them that could have dramatic effects on the world economy and world finance. Europe, our locus today, is of course somewhere in the middle. Europe is a close ally of the United States, but also deeply engaged with China in trade, finance, and a whole range of other issues, and does not see China as quite the existential security threat that many in the United States do. So the issue we face today is, where is this new global geopolitical context going? What are its likely developments? What will be the context, therefore, for international finance? How does a rising and really already risen China fit into that situation? What are the implications for the international monetary system and the world economy, and particularly for Europe and its role in global finance? China's rise, as we all know, dramatically alters the international economic order as well as the broader political scene. For over 100 years, since the United States became the supreme economy in the world, it has been number one, chiefly because it has had no real competitor. The United States has remained the supreme economy despite poor economic performance on several occasions, despite bad economic policies on a number of occasions. But the United States remained number one because there was no real competitor. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was never much of a factor in economic terms. Japan was the one economic competitor at one point, but was never large enough to be a true rival to the United States, and was in any event dependent on the US for security purposes, and therefore would never have really challenged the United States. China is thus undeniably the first real rival to the United States. Its economy is larger than the American economy on some metrics, the purchasing power parity comparison. It has been for almost a decade. Its trade is bigger. Its foreign exchange reserves are much bigger. It's ahead on certain technologies. I've never thought it makes too much difference whoever is ahead of the other by a few $1 billion of GDP or makes a few more computer chips. The bottom line is that China and the United States are now rough equivalents in terms of their global economic clout and therefore their impact on the global system. Hence, what we now have is two global economic superpowers, which raises the age-old issue of the rising power confronting the incumbent power in what some have labeled the Thucydides trap, going all the way back to the historic rivalry between Sparta and Athens. A team at Harvard has analyzed the history of that condition, concluded there have been 16 instances of rising challenger and incumbent power over the several last centuries. And in 12 of those 16 cases, the result was war. It was not inevitable, but it did occur frequently. And therefore, one has to take the risk seriously. The closest parallel, familiar to many here in this audience, will be the conflict between rising Germany and incumbent power Great Britain in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We know what that led to and the disastrous consequences of that particular manifestation of the Thucydides trap. I posit in my new book that there's an economic corollary to the Thucydides trap. And indeed, we already have an economic war, a trade war between the United States and China. It's been in place now for over 4 years. A technology war is certainly developing. And so we can already see the manifestation of this inherent conflict between rising and incumbent power in the global economic order. The US has been acting as if it were in that Thucydides world, trying to contain China, resisting anything that seemed to be enhancing China's global clout. China, for its part, is steadily increasing its stated ambition to be a world power. And so the seeds of that potential conflict have certainly been sown. If that's not enough, China's rise produces a second major global problem, namely the functioning of the world economic order. The international economic order, created basically at Bretton Woods at the end of the Second World War, has been absolutely crucial to the global peace and prosperity and stability of the last 75 years. That global order, in turn, has been largely preserved and maintained, not totally, but largely, by the leadership of the United States with the Europeans and its other close allies. But leadership has been critical in many situations. The US has had to come to the rescue, has had to provide global public goods, has been the key country maintaining, nurturing, sustaining the global economic system that has been so important. That US leadership, to a large extent on a unilateral basis, but often with its own allies, is no longer possible because of the rise of China, as I say, to functional equivalence with the United States as a global power. So it's essential to resolve most global economic issues now, be it global warming or fighting pandemics or keeping the trade system open or dealing with financial crises. It's mainly necessary to include China in global economic leadership on a cooperative basis. Fortunately, China itself has a huge stake in a continued open global economic system. That system has been crucial to China's economic miracle. The Chinese, to their credit, have fully integrated into the world economy. And so they do need to take responsibility to lead the system. They have done so on a number of occasions, like dealing with the global financial crisis over a decade ago, like agreeing with the US and Europe to push ahead on climate change at the Copenhagen summit 6 or 7 years ago. So China both needs an open system and realizes its need for an open system. But the question is whether the US and China can get together to maintain and pursue and develop a kind of cooperative global economic leadership that is required. The last time there was a transition of global economic leadership was the 1930s, when incumbent Great Britain was no longer able to provide leadership. The rising at the time United States was not yet willing to do so, and the result was a disaster. Economic historian Charles Kindleberger, in fact, argues that the Great Depression was brought on by the failure of global economic leadership, the downward spiral of trade, finance, the absence of a lender of last resort, all of which produced what we now can think of as the Kindleberger trap, adding on to the Thucydides trap as twin perils facing the global economy and more broadly in the wake of the rise of new power, China. Now, there's one important caveat to this picture I've painted of rising China to global equivalence and global power. And that is the world we're focusing on here, the world of international finance. Finance is the one main area, the one main set of issues where China has not risen yet, at least, to global prominence and leadership. Its domestic financial system is still relatively weak. It misallocates capital. It is subject to extensive government control. The allocation of capital is demonstrably inefficient, costing China, by most estimates, at least 2 percentage points of economic growth per year. The renminbi, China's currency, is still a very small factor in international finance, despite almost 20 years of Chinese effort to promote it. the maintenance of capital controls by China, the lack of convertibility of the RMB on a capital basis render the currency still relatively unattractive, and it plays a very minor role, probably 2% or less, in most international financial metrics. That situation is likely to continue. Chinese policy is headed in the wrong direction in terms of improving their financial system and internationalizing their currency. They're moving back toward greater state control, even greater state allocation of resources, not yet showing any of the moves toward marketization that would make for a global attractiveness of the RMB and a bigger international role in finance for China. So the question is, can China achieve its global economic ambitions without a bigger financial role for its currency and without an improvement in its financial markets, including to sustain a rapid rate of economic growth that would also be key to achieving the China dream that its leadership talks about so frequently and so aggressively. That set of situations that I have outlined suggests to me a huge opportunity for Europe. On the one hand, China desperately needs both a much better domestic financial system and a greater international presence and role for its currency. On the other hand, the United States, for its part, seems committed to an effort to contain China, to resist its rise, and indeed to decouple its economy from that of China in many regards, as already to a large extent in trade. All that is now spilling over into the financial side. Direct investment in both directions between China and the United States has plummeted over the last 2 or 3 years. Other financial flows have reduced substantially between the United States and China, and there are major moves within the US, including in the Congress, to change policy to cut off US financing of China on the grounds that that's financing the enemy. So it looks like a collision course on finance between China and the US, which in my view then provides a major opportunity for Europe. Now, Europe, of course, is a close US ally. It supports US sanctions on China, or Russia now, of course, in areas where that is legitimate and justified. And Europe obviously would not want to risk its own security or American security or undermine its own values by essentially strengthening the enemy, if one thought China was to be an implacable enemy forever. But Europe, I think wisely, has not supported all US steps vis-a-vis China. It certainly did not emulate US trade war against China, I think rightly so. And in fact, European trade with China has increased over the last 2 or 3 years, while US-China trade has plummeted. Europe, all European countries did join the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, despite the US rejection of that bank and its efforts to persuade its allies not to join. They wisely went ahead and did it. And certainly, European countries would not want to accept any notion of inevitability of conflict between China and the West, closure of the Thucydides trap. Europe, to its great credit, during this period of US-China confrontation, has tried to intermediate, work out solutions in the World Trade Organization, elsewhere, to avoid a further downward spiral of relations and therefore the risk of global conflict. So it seems to me that this, as I say, is a big opportunity for Europe, which in my view can and should pursue an increased set of relationships with China in the economic and especially the financial services domain. I call this in my new book, functional decoupling. A recognition that we in the West will continue to have problems and even confrontations with China on security issues in the South China Sea, on values issues like the treatment of Hong Kong and the Uyghurs and certainly Taiwan, but at the same time can continue to cooperate on economic and especially financial issues. That has worked on a number of recent occasions. The West and China did cooperate at the Glasgow Summit on climate change and may be in the process of starting to do so again at Sharm el-Sheikh. We have cooperated at the Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization last summer, resolved some very thorny issues that kept the WTO afloat and in fact began to resuscitate its central role in world trade. The US and China recently got together on some technical issues concerning financial accounting and standards and technical practices, which permit Chinese securities to continue being traded in the United States. So functional decoupling, I think, has demonstrably worked on a number of occasions and can continue to do so. When Chancellor Scholz of Germany went to China recently amid some criticism, I think he was rightly continuing to pursue some effort at cooperative relations between his country, Europe more broadly, and China. So this functional decoupling, I think, needs to become the centerpiece of relations between the West and China. It's very different from national decoupling. Some people propose a complete cessation of relationships between the West, or at least the US, and China. I think that would be foolhardy, foolish. It would give in to the Thucydides trap. It would increase the risk of broader conflict. It would cause huge economic costs to be accepted. I think it's a very bad idea. And functional decoupling is the way to go. The Biden administration in the United States, which has continued Trump's policies on trade and technology and investment, do permit for the possibility of this functional decoupling. President Biden and his people, even before they came into office, but certainly since, and including at the meeting in Bali, have pointed to different baskets of relationships, different components of the relationship with China. Some will be confrontational, some will be highly competitive, but some can be cooperative. The Biden administration has sought cooperation on global warming, on pandemic responses without much success, but need to put economic issues, as they have on a couple of recent occasions, as I mentioned, need to put economic issues into that context. And here I think Europe can come to the rescue once again. If Europe pursues judiciously, but forcefully and straightforwardly, increased financial relations with China, both helping it develop its internal financial system and to enhance the international role of the renminbi, I think that would be hugely constructive, hugely positive in terms of responding to both traps. It would begin to provide China with the wherewithal to play the kind of global leadership role in finance that it needs to accompany such a role on trade and investment. It would reduce the risk of hostile confrontation between China and the United States or the West more broadly that could bring the Thucydides trap into realization and bring the world into conflict more broadly. The Biden administration has indicated at Bali a willingness and an openness to move in the direction. I think its European friends need to push it a bit to pursue functional decoupling, a more systematic effort to restore cooperation with China on trade issues while maintaining differences and even hostility on security and political fronts. That, I think, is something that Europe can do on its own. to its great advantage in finance, as it has gained on trade in the face of the US-China trade war, and in helping its traditional ally and partner to get back onto a more constructive path with China. I hope this event pushes thinking in that direction. It's been a great pleasure to speak with you, and I look forward to further exchanges in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Bergsten. Now, building on this perspective, a perspective Dr. Bergsten has just shared about this rebalancing of international economic and geopolitical dynamics, our first panel today will discuss how global firms, how financial and services practitioners and investors can navigate these dynamics and also the changing landscape in China. And the discussion will be led by Luxembourg for Finance very own CEO Nicolas Mackel. Very good morning to you, Nicolas, and over to you.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much, dear Judith, for this very kind introduction. And thank you also from my side as the organizer to not only the previous speakers, Minister of Finance Yuriko, but also Dr. Bergsten, but obviously also to all the other speakers, those that join me in a minute for our panel and those that will follow us. Obviously also a great warm welcome to you out there in the audience for joining us for what should be a very interesting discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, Luxembourg for Finance has started this yearly conference in 2014 at a moment when China really started again to push its opening up. It has grown since to become the main trading partner of 128 countries around the world. Multinationals from everywhere had been producing cheaply in China to export to world markets, and then came to see also China as a market of vast opportunity with its 1.4 billion consumers. China's market indeed today matters for European firms, but also for firms from other continents. It matters to the point where even an announcement of the slight loosening of COVID restrictions in China has helped to boost the value of French luxury brand LVMH, which in turn has contributed to Paris stealing London's crown as the leading stock market in Europe. That is how much China actually matters. Chinese companies ventured out more and more and became welcome investors. More Chinese banks set up branches and subsidiaries in many countries where they were received with open arms by authorities of financial centers eager to be designated as renminbi hubs. And China opened its capital markets for foreign investors, hungry for RMB exposure, and of course the high returns that come with 6 to 7% growth rates. This brought banks and asset managers from around the world also to China. Now, fast forward to today, ladies and gentlemen, and this love affair has met a number of bumps. It even appears to be heading for a breakup, or in today's language, a decoupling. To put it mildly, China's star seems to be losing its shine in many Western countries where politicians today can score cheap points by bashing China. Obviously and undeniably, there are issues that have emerged from market access conditions, obviously also to diverging views on important things like human rights. How do businesses and financial institutions adapt to the growing tensions and navigate the shoals of doing business in China? Will China's prolonged COVID restrictions have leave lasting scars to the way multinationals are viewing doing business in China? What conclusions are we to draw from the recent Party Congress and China's direction under President Xi? Well, these are some of the questions we will be discussing in the next 30 minutes. And to do that, I am joined by a panel of stellar China experts, starting with Dr. Jörg Wuttke, who's the chief representative of Germany's BASF in China, and also a long-standing chairman, president of the European or the EU Chamber of Commerce in China. He's also a member of the advisory board of the Mercator Institute for China Studies, MERIX in Berlin, and he is, notwithstanding his young age, an old China hand, what you truly called an old China hand, because he has lived in Beijing for more than 3 decades and has, I think, started his love affair with China more than 40 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. We are also joined by Houze Song. Houze is a fellow at MacroPolo, a US research institute, where he leads the think tank's work on China's economy. Houze writes, for instance, MP Econ, a Substack research node on the Chinese economy. His work is read by market participants and policymakers, and is regularly quoted by major media outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Financial Times, Bloomberg, and New York Times. And then, last but certainly not least, Dr. Huiyao Wang, known to us as Henry and to many people around the world as well, who is the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization, CCG, the leading Chinese non-governmental think tank. He's, among many other functions, also vice chairman of China Association of International Economic Cooperation under Ministry of Commerce, and holds different leadership roles at the Chinese People's Institute of Foreign Affairs, the China National Committee for Pacific Economic Cooperation, and is the Dean of the Institute of Development Studies of Southwestern University of Finance and Economics of China. Now, you may have all been impressed, ladies and gentlemen, about the 46 books that Dr. Bergsten has written, but you should know that Henry Wang has written nearly 100 books on China in both Chinese and English. So, ladies and gentlemen, with this panel, let us get started. And maybe, if I may, start with Jörg Wuttke. You have been in China for many years. You have seen the different trends, the different crises, the different highs and lows. What is today, from your vantage point as the president of the EU Chamber of Commerce, the business sentiment among companies in China?
Well, Nicolas, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm afraid that I qualify for the world all around. Aging with China was a privilege, and I love to be here. I've witnessed the largest economic comeback story in human history. And now, of course, I'm eager to figure out where China's heading. Again, if we are looking at the European Chamber, which has offices in 9 cities in China, 1,800 members. We have just published our position paper in September. That's the Bible about where the issues are in China. And again, it has 430 pages and 967 recommendations, telling you 2 things. First of all, China is a damn difficult market. Market access is still very problematic for particularly the service sector. But it also tells you that our members are committed to China. They believe the reformability of China. Otherwise, we wouldn't produce nearly 1,000 recommendations for the leadership. It would rather be collecting dust in the shelf. So we are still out there hoping that China actually can move down the road of reform and opening up. But what we have realized in this period of time of, as put it, bumpy road, is that we have top 10 companies, consistently European companies, putting money into the Chinese market, including my own. And the reason for it is that there is no second market anywhere close to the size of the Chinese economy. For example, in the car industry, it's about 33% global market is in China. In the machinery market, China is as big as US, Europe, and Japan put together. And in my own backyard, the chemical sector, China stands for 50%, meaning if you're not at the table, you're going to be in the menu. So no chances to actually look around to do something else. Hence, we will invest money in China. But What we have realized recently is that from the top 10 that used to contribute 50% of foreign direct investment from Europe into China, now they stand for 80+%. So what is wrong with all the other companies? Well, SMEs are primarily putting their operations on hold. They are putting basically resources in here in order to maintain the operations, but not really much more money. And they're looking for alternatives because their owners or the CEOs cannot easily travel. So it is up to the top 10 in order to make up the difference. If you take aside the big BMW acquisition of billions in the first quarter, actually we have noticed that the European investment in China in the first half of this year went down by 72%. Again, telling you that the big boys stay here, put in more money, but the others apparently are really looking for options, which is a concern to us, because it is an ill representation of what European companies have to offer. We are in an uncertain period of time. Certainly COVID is to be blamed for that one. We have new policies coming out that really don't find the traction yet. We are supposed to get tested every day, but then the test stations, for example, here in Beijing stopped. We have a new policy 5+3, which indicates China is easing up in order to attract foreign visitors. But if you land in the wrong city of China, such as European Chamber employees just did, you do your 7 days, you do 3 days of home quarantine, and then 15 days in Tianjin, you can't get into the neighboring city of Beijing. You have to go to Shenyang, do 15 days, and then you can come back. So all of a sudden, the whole system turns into 7+3+30. In a way, it's easier to get from Korea, from Tianjin to Korea and back to Beijing than from Tianjin to Beijing. So we have lots of domestic traveling issues there. And that, of course, puts a damper on sentiment. And sentiment is what I worry most about it. China has deep pockets. They can deal with the real estate crisis. They, I'm sure, can deal with a number of things. But the sentiment, particularly among those that matter the most of us, Chinese private enterprises, is taking a hit. And those were the guys bringing China to where they are today. So let's hope that they actually find their place in the economy in order to contribute again to what they did over the last 10 years.
Jörg, if I listen to you, I get a very clear sense about the reasons why, as you say, SMEs or smaller companies put their activities in China on hold, which seems to be, if I interpret you correctly, mostly COVID-related and due to the restrictions. So political reasons, are they also contributing to this in one way or another among your members?
Not yet, or not at this stage. If you excuse that, of course, COVID policy is a political decision, and we could challenge that, which we have done in the European Chamber. We thought the zero tolerance is great for 2 years. It buys you time to do vaccination. The part of vaccination was missing. But overall, we don't have anybody moving away because the Communist Party has rearranged its furniture. So in a way, we don't really see companies leaving China. Again, SMEs are putting the operations on hold, not on hold, as a matter of on autopilot. They invest a little bit, but far less than the economy would actually justify. And of course, the COVID policy, the downturn of the economic growth, the World Bank says 2.8% this year. Then all of a sudden, the rest of Asia at 5.3% looks very much more charming. And then guys go to Singapore, Jakarta, Thailand, look at this. And that's what I worry about, that they find an appetite. China cannot really open up, and they might stay there. Again, that only refers to the majority of my members, the SMEs, the Big Ten are here to stay because there's no other option. So in a way, politics is not the driving force, it's market.
Okay, let's maybe turn to Houze and get from him his view on what really he sees in terms of evolution of trade and investment numbers. Houze, in your work as a China economic analyst, where do you see this tending? Some people, Dr. Bergsten has said that China-US trade is plummeting. Others, if you look at the numbers, would say that is not exactly the case. What is happening, both for trade, for investments, FDI, as well as maybe portfolio investments?
Thanks for the invite. Yeah, during my research, it seemed to me that Although that many people fear that with since the trade war and the recent geopolitical tensions, that China will be gradually and decoupled from the rest of the world. But the data doesn't support this view. For example, China, despite the trade war and the recent tensions, China's share in global trade has actually increased compared to 2018. It's now at a record high level, and it remains the world's largest exporter. But in the meantime, you see actually the composition of the trade, especially export, that the share of Chinese export that manufactured, produced by foreign firms has been keep declining. Actually, this trend of declining can be traced back to the 2008 global financial crisis, albeit the costs may be different now than previously. That if you trace the data to a decade back, that you see that initially there was a quite rapid declining of Chinese export manufactured by foreign firms in China. And this trend has stabilized somewhat around 2016, 2017, but since the onset of the trade war, that we see the foreign share of Chinese export continue to decline. And this trend continues up till now. But on the other hand, you see, especially during since the global recovery, the global reopening since COVID, that China's export has been growing at double digit. So basically, we have two pictures. One is that there are fewer foreign firms that manufacturing in China for the world. But in the meantime, the global demand for Chinese goods continue to be very robust. So that's on the trade front. And on the investment front, I agree with that it's not, the picture is not very promising, especially FDI. FDI, once you removed Hong Kong, the money coming from Hong Kong, which actually includes a lot of the money that actually raised by Chinese firms from Hong Kong. So once you exclude FDI from Hong Kong, FDI from the rest of the world into China has been largely flat since 2017. Given that the size of the Chinese economy has increased by 30–40% during the same time, this means the relative percentage of FDI in China's total economy has declined. So in this sense, FDI part is not, the picture is not very optimistic. But on the other hand, the portfolio side is the picture is more promising, that both inward and outward investment, you see that there has been some moderate growth over the years. On the one hand, it's really because the Beijing has removed some of the previous restrictions on foreign portfolio investment into China, for example, through the Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Hong Kong, Shenzhen Stock and Bond Connect program. Okay. On the other hand, because the strong performance of China's exporter sectors, that actually China's current account surplus has been accumulating again, basically since 2020. So because China now still runs, for example, this year, China is projected to run current account surplus larger than 2% of GDP. That basically means more than $20 billion current account surplus annually. So one way or another, that Beijing and the Chinese, especially Chinese exporters, has to recycle those current account surplus and invest them in the rest of the world. And actually, here, I think there are definitely more work to do, because currently the restrictions on domestic investors' ability to invest abroad is still limited.
Good.
So yeah, so that's basically what the current trade and investment picture tell us.
Okay, thank you very much for that candid assessment. And that allows me then maybe also to ask Henry, With the challenges that have been drawn by Jörg and Houze, what can we expect from the Chinese leadership following the Party Congress? What are the priorities, in particular in terms of business?
Yes, thank you, Nicolas, and it's great to join this great forum. And I think that they just concluded not too long ago, the 20th Party Congress has set quite a few objectives. I mean, that should be really watched out by business. First is, I think they emphasize that the Chinese path of modernization. Basically, I think now China is really wants to find a unique way of sustaining its economy. I mean, we know that China is, basically 60% of the private sector, generate 80 to 90% of the employment, and of course, over 50% of the tax revenue as well. But we have another 20% SOE that does all the, social responsibility, disaster relief, and, all those dirty jobs that public welfare jobs type of things. So, like build a speed railway that is not really profitable, but needed in China. And of course, parachute 40,000 medical staff into Wuhan to do the COVID fighting and things like that, or earthquake relief and or big flood control and things like that. So I think China is a big country, and they need that. They need that force. And there's another 20% of multinationalism and multilateral corporations, and then they actually employs 40 to 50 million Chinese employment. Like Foxconn employs over 2 million, just one company. So they are actually generate almost 40 to 50% of China import and export. So that's I think that kind of unique this synergy, and then more diversified economy is really hybrid economy is really what China's unique model that paved the way for the Chinese path of modernization. So that should be noted. I think China has said again they're going to continue, and President Xi said that his final speech, China door will be open wider and wider. So, and also from the the 4 top new standing committee members that has been promoted, including the Li Qiang, the second standing committee member. They all coming from a very developed area. Like Li Qiang has come up from Wenzhou. He actually in Zhejiang he cultivated Alibaba. In Shanghai he imported Tesla. I mean, so they are really market oriented. So if they are coming into the play, I think China will follow this market open and positive path for the future. And in terms of another thing I think we should notice is, of course, there's a lot of talk about common prosperity in the party's report. But common prosperity is that President Xi always attached great importance. We're having a deglobalization. We have a nationalism, populism. So we should avoid some mistakes other countries. There's a polarizing of the society. There's a loose middle class, and things like that. On the contrary, I think China has paid attention to that and first lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Now for the common prosperity, they are coming out to, how about this 300 million migrant workers? There's 2 million working for Foxconn, for example, for Apple. How to elevate them into middle class. And then China has cultivated the 400 million middle class. What about the rest of the 1 billion, population? When can we make them into middle class? So this indicates that we have a huge potential in China. And in the next 10, 20 years, China middle class is going to grow, and China is going to really have a lot of things to offer. So I think even now the COVID has relaxed just a little bit. You can see the stock market bouncing back, and there's a lot of optimism coming back. I'm sure China will continue to do that. Definitely, they're not silly. They're not foolish. I mean, if things doesn't work for them, there's no reason for them to continue on that. So I think they will optimize their system, as they use the word optimize. I'm sure they'll continue to optimize that. And then of course also we see recently the G20 meeting just out of Bali that I think President Xi and President Biden, first time they met in person since 3 years. And they're old friends, but they're meeting in person with great smile, big shake hand without mask. It sent a huge huge messages around the world. But I was quite surprised. President Biden even comes out to say, make a special news conference saying that, look, he doesn't think China is going to impose imminent attack on Taiwan. So that's really, I mean, relieve a lot of business concerns. A lot of B-plan was making. They were expecting China probably going to attack Taiwan next year or next 5 years. President Biden said there's no imminent threat on that. So I think this is a great message. I think hopefully now that when both leaders talk more, and then President Biden is sending Blinken to Secretary to Beijing, I'm sure there are going to be reciprocal visits. And I also talk about the economic, finance, and climate change and other matters. They're going to have respective officials to visit each other. I'm sure we can probably put a floor to the deteriorating free falling of the downward spiral in the last several years we've been seeing. And I'm glad now that
hope so.
Yeah, but also now, of course, that President Biden and President Xi has gone through their domestic election. They look stronger than they used to be. So I think now they can probably talk about really business concerns and really do some common sense things rather than decoupling from each other. So I think we read a lot into that. I think it gives a quite cautious, optimistic picture ahead.
Good. Well, we need optimism, but China, as you rightly say, has always been very rational when it came to its business strategies. Now, Jörg, do you share the optimism that has just been expressed by Henry concerning the continued drive for reform as he interprets into the different appointments? I know that you are a well-experienced reader of Chinese tea leaves. We Westerners, when we watch the party Congress, are left to simply interpret certain gestures and very often get it wrong. But maybe with the subtitles that you can provide, we understand a little bit better.
Well, I wish I can tell you something definitive. Again, the political change is only concluded in March next year when the new government is in place. We have a bit of an unusual situation of having none of the state council members, meaning the government, representing on the Politburo. That is a period of uncertainty we're facing. So where does the messaging come from? Is Li Keqiang still speaking for China, or is the Politburo going to give us something we don't know? In particular, of course, in terms of COVID, it would be nice in order to know where we are heading. At the same time, I'm facing a lot of meetings these days sought after by the Chinese party and the ministries in order to actually get explanations. There's a clear reaching out in order to explain to foreign business or the stakeholders like the European Chamber in order to tell them we're going to go down this road of reform and opening up and so forth. But again, the truth lies in the acts and not in rhetoric. We have to see. But at the same time also, we are looking at market dynamics. As Henry pointed out, the urbanization is continuing, so meaning there is more economic firepower in order to actually move ahead. We have known from many other economies in East Asia, like Taiwan, Japan and Korea, that after 40 years of opening up, they all faced a hiccup. They rebounded at different degrees. Of course, we hope that the largest economy in the world actually goes through this hiccup smooth and easy. But we don't know. In a sense, with $17,800 per capita GDP in PPP terms, and so there's a lot for China still to gain, and all our scenarios lead to the fact that even in the worst case, China's economy per capita is going to double by 2050. And again, that's worst case. The best case, look up our position paper. It's actually quite charming to see. There's a huge potential here. But again, we have to see 6 months of uncertainty is, of course, too long, but what can we do?
Yeah. If we now put ourselves in a position where we try to look into the future. Now, we all learned over the last 2 or 3 years that looking into the future is even more difficult than what we thought it was going to be. But if we try to look into the future, what will not only be China's economy, what will impact China's economy most, and how will we position ourselves as Europe or as the US? I don't know if President Biden and President Xi even touched on the recent US restrictions imposed on semiconductors, but probably that is one of the defining elements of their relationship? Or we talked before about, Jörg said that SMEs may put on hold some of their activities regarding the Chinese market. I read recently in a New York Times column penned by Thomas Friedman a new acronym, ABC, standing for anything but China. Do you have the impression that the political rhetoric has already started to take root in business decisions, or is it, as we discussed before, currently still only travel restrictions mostly and other restrictions that make it difficult to do business? Is it the increasing heat of the political tensions that drive decisions? Maybe it's not only Chinese tech that, according to some, is becoming uninvestable, but is it China in general that, for US players at least, we understand Europeans take a different view, but very often don't lag far behind Americans. How do you see this playing out? I don't know, Houze, if you want to say something about the escalation of the chip war that our American friends seem to be pursuing. Is that something that you see playing out on the economic sphere in China in terms of GDP?
The recent semiconductor ban will definitely have an impact on China's growth, but my guess it will be quite modest. I see now, right now, as what the estimate, I see that the kind of like the most, the top range estimate is something like 0.3, 0.4% of Chinese growth. So that's definitely not an insignificant number, but will that, for example, prevent China doubling its GDP during the next 15, 20 years? I don't think so, because if you look at the recent global history of economic development, you see that actually many countries have managed to achieve like GDP per capita of $20,000 without develop highly advanced industries like semiconductors. So I think semiconductor and other like AI and biotech, they're definitely good to have, but they're not essential, for example, for China to achieve income per capita of high income countries. On the other hand, I see that so far what I see from the data is that the impact of geopolitical tensions and US tensions on Chinese economy is can be more properly described as death by 1,000 cuts, rather than that it will lead to a collapse or sudden stop in any particular sector. We are now seeing that from the data that there has been an acceleration, despite the recent data, there has also been the impact of COVID. So, but still, we are not seeing any signs of there's sudden accelerations of slowdown in foreign activities in China.
Okay. Jörg, any thoughts on this?
Well, definitely it was a shock to see to what extent the US is going to basically involve in banning China on the high-tech side. Again, we are in the real economy. We don't see an instant translation into the car, machinery or chemical sector, but of course there will be a slower growth in the innovative part of this economy. These are our partners and suppliers as well as customers. So eventually, yes, there might be an impact. At the same time, again, the economy is not just growing on that segment. ABC, I mean, my friend Tom coined that. It has more possibly to do with fund managers. The real economy is still, with the big boys, is going to go ahead. The SMEs wait for China to sort itself out on COVID. They put it on hold. They look for options. And again, and that's into China's field in order to make sure that the transition from now into opening up and having gone on like the rest of the world is very important. The longer this takes, the more people will look into stakes in Indonesia, in Malaysia, Thailand, in India. They're not going to come back. Again, it's too early for us to tell. the instant reporting from the 20th Party Congress was more like, more communism. Mentioned Xi Jinping mentioned Marx 15 times, the market 3 times. That's certainly not very conducive for foreign business or business as a whole. I think the core to us is not how they treat us. They need our technologies. We are in the real economy. What happens to the Chinese private enterprises, how they will be integrated, and that is to us where the Chinese economic futures are going to lie.
Okay, and maybe if I come back to you, Henry, and ask you, what is it that you think China can or should do to reconnect to those businesses that we just heard are turning elsewhere?
Yeah. Thank you, Nicolas. I think that in terms of the this chips policy that the latest U.S. government on that, I think it's really a silly. It's really against economic law, against competitive advantage. I mean, the reason those semiconductor companies like in Taiwan or in South Korea can grow so big is because China is the largest buyer. China is the largest market, and they are so close to China. And so I think, if they do that, it's a semi-suicidal action that they're going to hurt their profit, bottom lines, they're going to hurt R&D, they hurt many things, and actually force China to do it on its own, and maybe a few years delay, and China can probably make things happen. And we remember all the Soviet Union days. I mean, they blocked China on everything, but after a few years, China, made everything happen again as well. So I don't think it's a very wise policy. But I do have a little hope though that because since they had this high-level visit meeting by President Xi and President Biden, so we're seeing more business people, leaders, and big government officials traveling to China to talk. So I don't think the business can bear that. This kind of silly policy hurting business bottom line. Nobody can really hurt. So if the security issue can be really lifted somewhat, I think maybe economically they can lift somewhat as well. And I remember during the Trump era, when they even have the big tariff from China, there's always a backdoor to get some exemptions, to get some special category that can be exempted from tariff.
Was a good example.
That's right. So I hope they can do that. I mean, you talk about China. China is probably the best market synergy in the world. You have 280 million, college graduates among population. Every year produce 10 million college graduates. They have the 2/3 of global speed railways. They have this, out of the 10 largest container ports, 7 of them are in China. Out of the, I see U.S. is just starting to build the 5G station. There are already 2 million 5G stations across China. So where on earth can you find a place, big market? So I think it's just in China for China would be really lucrative enough for all the companies to come. Let alone we could still have another 400 million middle class coming up. In addition to the 400 million they have now. So I'm quite optimistic on that, actually.
Good. Well, I'm not going to ask Jörg and Houze if they share your optimism, because I did that a few minutes ago. But I will ask Jörg and Houze for one last comment in conclusion on China. Where do you see China in 5 years? Is it still the main trading partner of 128 countries? Is it still this very vast market of opportunity? Jörg, maybe you start.
Well, I'm a bit pessimistic about next year, but 5 years from now, I'm sure that China finds track again. China has a great comeback gene, has proven it time and again. I hope that they are going to be a strong trading partner, but more on a level playing field, meaning that they are not just shipping 4 items to Europe and importing 1 item. I hope that China opens up more in order to also credibly create more jobs in Europe. That would help a great way in order to solve a couple of these challenges. Though China has basically a long stretch of development to go, and it's for me always the largest risk in the China business is not to be in China.
Very well put. Houze, you have one last comment on where do you see China in 5 years? Optimistic?
I would say I'm cautiously optimistic, but we also need to have a realistic expectation. For example, on the domestic demand issues, on whether China will generate more, China will import more and generate jobs, for example, in Europe and America. I would say that it's possible that China will import more, but we should have really realistic expectations, because I think this ultimately the root cause of China's insufficient demand is lie in its domestic income distribution. That the household sector has the share of income goes to the household sector is quite low in China compared to global average. And China, basically, since the onset of global financial crisis more than a decade ago, China has already begun this process of trying to increase the share of income go to the household sector, which will enable China to generate more domestic demand. So through the past 10 plus years, China has made some progress, but the progress is quite modest. So I guess in a kind of like, even in the best case scenario, I would say that 5 years now, that we still should be quite cautious about how much progress China can make on this front. But still, I think the direction is really ultimately what really matters. The direction, the outlook, that the rest of the world need to have confidence in China, that knows China is on this right path, that China will continue, the property sector, the private sector in China will continue to prosper, and Chinese household income will continue to increase at least similar at the same rate as the overall GDP growth. As long as those things happen, I think that the rest of the world and the foreign business confidence in China may improve from the current cyclical low point.
Good. Yes, I remember vividly when I moved to Shanghai 10 years ago that there was this paper by the World Bank and by Liao on China 2030 that recommended also boosting internal consumption, and 10 years later, we see it's not so easy. But I also see that in the same period of time, China has continued to grow and still is one of the leading markets, so certainly has quite a lot going for it. Besides all the challenges and the issues that obviously we need to deal with our Chinese friends in order to make it possible for businesses to help us also boost growth and create jobs both in China and in Europe, which is to all of our benefits. With this, gentlemen, we come to the end of our panel. I thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. We could obviously go on because China is a topic that certainly has much more to offer than something you can fit into 35 minutes, but we have to stop here, and there will be other elements for which I now hand back to our moderator, Judith Bogner. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Nicolas Mackel there with his panel speakers, Dr. Henry Wang, Houze, and of course, Yuriko. I think we can all appreciate this thoughtful, grounded discussion and assessment of certainly a difficult situation that firms operating in China find themselves in. I take away for myself some short-term concern, some optimism though, and certainly an economic trajectory that is inspiring, of course, hope going forward. And to talk more about that, let's add the economic perspective to the picture. We know that the tally for the first half of this year shows that the Chinese economy expanded 2.5%. This would suggest that full year growth could remain below the 5.5% target set by the Chinese government. Now, what does the macroeconomic dynamic below and behind the headline figure tell us about China's economic trajectory going forward, and what are the trends driving this trajectory? And to answer that question, I have the pleasure to welcome back a familiar face for the audience of the China Finance Forum, Frederic Neumann. He's, of course, HSBC's Chief Asia Economist and Co-Head of Global Research in Asia. Good to have you back with us, Fred, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Judith. It's been a very tough year, the year of the tiger for China, make no bones about it. Certainly growth has suffered. You just cited the numbers for the first half of the year. What is really causing that slowdown in China? There are a number of factors very clearly. We have to acknowledge the fact that the housing market, which is really about a quarter of GDP in terms of housing construction, is still struggling to make headways to stabilize. We've seen last year the Chinese authorities tighten the reins on financing for developers, and those effects are still spilling over into this year. And that's a big headwind that's really restraining growth. The second issue then, of course, is the zero COVID policy or the restrictions on the virus. And that is, of course, hampering consumer spending, services in China as well. And that's always been a big growth driver in recent years. And that too is weighing on economic growth. So when we add all of this together, we're probably going to arrive at a number this year of GDP growth somewhere around 3 to 3.5%, which by some global standards is still very respectable, but by China's own very lofty standards, of course, falls very much short of the ambition, of the capacity, of the trend of the economy overall. Now, those are the two headline drags on economic growth. We would add actually a third factor that's also weighing on the economy, and that is really the political transition that we've seen this year. Of course, China has had its party congress in October of this year. And usually during the run-up to a party congress, we see a lot of shifting in appointments, for example, at the local level, at the national level. And that also kind of gums up the policy process. We don't get quite as quick policy implementation. And so that too kind of slowed down a little bit at the margin infrastructure spending, which otherwise would have been even stronger than what we have seen. So here then are the three factors that are restraining economic growth in China. But it's not all negative. In fact, I know the headlines sometimes look very challenging, but there were pockets of growth over the course of this year, during the year of the tiger. For example, the export side still doing quite well. China continues to gain global export market share through this year. Of course, part of it still pandemic related, but China's economy remains enormously competitive, and that's of course helping economic growth. And domestically, we also had some sectors actually did reasonably well. For example, the automotive sector in China, car sales doing quite well. Even if overall consumer spending was quite weak, car sales actually did quite well. In fact, electric vehicle battery sales or alternative energy vehicles doing particularly well in China. So there are pockets where in fact growth is still coming through, and that is just about helping us to get to a number of 3 to 3.5%. Now, I will admit that when you talk to international investors, for example, the sentiment at the moment is somewhat downbeat, of course, because of global developments, in large part, but also specifically when it comes to China, because many investors were surprised by the weakness in economic growth this year. And then coming out of the party Congress, there was some disappointment that there weren't big policy announcements in terms of generating breakthroughs on reforms, for example. Now, we think actually that's a misinterpretation about what the Congress is for. The real policy decisions will be taken at the end of this year at the Economic Works Conference, early next year. Really, the party Congress in October was mostly a political event, and therefore the big economic decisions about reforms are still coming up. But we detect already a big focus in the last few weeks by the government on trying to stabilize economic growth and engineer that cyclical recovery. And we remain quite optimistic, actually, that going into 2023, we might see a fairly robust cyclical recovery coming through. And there are really three different pillars for this cyclical recovery. The first, of course, and the most important, is probably a relaxation of virus control measures. And in recent days, the government, in fact, announced an action plan of about 21 items where they already start to relax some of these very stringent controls. There's a lot more than need to be done to stabilize the economy. But we remain optimistic that over the first half of next year, you're going to see a gradual relaxation that allows consumer spending to breathe again, to accelerate services sectors come back. And that should certainly be the first pillar of a recovery, just as we've seen in other countries in the world, a lot of pent-up demand that is coming through. Now, the second big pillar of the cyclical recovery lies in the housing market. We have to stabilize housing construction in order to put a floor under economic growth. As I said, it's about a fifth to 1/4 of GDP by some measures. And so stabilizing housing construction will be key here. And again, in the last few weeks, we saw the government come out with a measure, 16 measures by some count, to try to stabilize housing construction, which will go a long way to lift GDP growth over the coming year. And that's part of that cyclical recovery that we're counting on. And then the last third pillar really of that recovery is going to be faster policy implementation, more spending on infrastructure, particularly after officials have been reappointed, moved to different positions within China. You get that better policy implementation of the coming year, which would also then further help to drive up economic growth. So where does this leave us? It leaves us at about 5.2% growth for the coming year. And we should think about this as a cyclical recovery from an economy that is kind of restrained right now by some of the virus control measures, by some of that correction in the housing market that we saw last year that's still spilling over into this year. Once the pent-up demand comes back, even if exports slow into next year, we believe that China is certainly capable of delivering north of 5% growth. And that, I think, in the global context is an important stabilization narrative, given that we potentially see weaker growth in other parts of the world. China certainly goes counter-cyclical and helps a stabilization in terms of putting a floor under demand, not least for global commodity prices as well. Now, that is the cyclical outlook. But of course, many investors that we speak to have questions about the structural issues that are facing the Chinese economy. And we shouldn't downplay some of these structural headwinds that are coming through. For example, when it comes to demographics, yes, the demographics look challenging on some measures. The working age population is shrinking at a rapid pace, comparable perhaps to what we saw in Japan. And that's, of course, a headwind for economic growth. Then we also see other structural headwinds coming through, for example, in the housing market. Even if we see a gradual recovery of the coming year, it is clear that over the coming years, over the coming decade, that housing construction as a share of GDP, as a contributor to GDP growth, will need to shrink, partly because underlying housing demand is no longer robust enough to really absorb the amount of construction that's going on in the economy. And so there's a structural headwind, therefore, for economic growth that will pull down the overall economic growth rate as well. And then, of course, a third factor that is really a structural headwind is, of course, the high leverage in certain parts of the economy. We see, for example, local governments having leveraged up quite a bit in recent years, spending on infrastructure, for example. Here, Beijing has really applied tighter reins. And so the limit on credit growth, on debt creation, is going to be a bit of a medium-term headwind for economic growth as well. And that not only reduces economic growth somewhat, but it also means that we should think in terms of Chinese economic growth shifting, other growth drivers becoming more important. So I mentioned three headwinds for structural growth in China that will lower the trend growth rate from about 6% before the pandemic to what we believe around 4 to 4.5%. Now, at that pace, given that's the second largest economy in the world, China is still going to contribute more than double the incremental GDP that the US economy is projected to generate over the next 5 years or so. So even at that reduced growth rate, China still delivers enormous amount of growth potential, almost $1 trillion of incremental GDP growth in years to come. Now, that is certainly a reason why we believe China will remain the game in town when it comes to growth, to investment in the Asia-Pacific region. But it's not just about that the growth rate will remain around 4 to 4.5%. It's also that there's a shift in the composition of the growth rate. For example, growth has been investment-led, housing construction being particularly important, but also investment in infrastructure projects. We think here there will be a subtle shift. Certainly the policy direction overall is to encourage greater consumption, greater services, greater investment in high-tech industries, which leads to higher paying jobs. And that should mean that the contribution of consumer spending to GDP growth should continue to pick up, even if the overall GDP growth decelerate. So we think really of China as being increasingly a consumption-led economy in years to come, and moving away from that heavy reliance on housing construction in particular. Now, this is the ideal path, but of course there are challenges, there are implementation challenges. And one of the messages from the Party Congress we just heard is that actually the leadership is quite aware of these implementation challenges. What are these challenges? Well, in order to address China's structural challenges that are highlighted, demographics, debt, and the shrinking of the housing sector, we really need to accelerate productivity growth. You cannot really deliver even 4 to 4.5% trend growth rate without accelerating productivity efficiency gains in the economy. Here, we think that the government will continue to focus particularly on human capital, that is better education, particularly at the very advanced level. It will make more money available for R&D and encourage investment, particularly in high-tech areas, high-tech investment that should ultimately benefit the overall economy and generate that productivity growth. So that is really the growth plan for China, and I do believe that in many ways the setback in sentiment that we've seen around China in recent weeks was partly an over worrying about some of that deceleration in growth that we're seeing. Yes, there's a step down in GDP growth in China from about 6% to around, let's say, 4%. But even at that pace, we're still going to generate enormous incremental GDP growth. And so I think there needs to be a reassessment in terms of how much that slowdown really detracts from the overall development of the Chinese economy. It is a mature economy where per capita income growth is coming close to developed market levels. And so at that point, we would naturally expect a slowing in GDP growth. Now, what is China's role in the world in all of this? Well, here too is a structural headwind to some extent, because the easy gains on trade are past us. China's share of world exports has risen to about 16%. And in the past, rarely has any country really exceeded that level of global trade. It was easy kind of in the 1990s and 2000s for China to gain market share. But today, given China's large size, it'll be harder and harder to really gain global market share. That doesn't mean that exports won't be growing, but they'll grow more in line with global GDP growth rather than China kind of absorbing still more of that export share globally. And that will also mean that at the margin, exports become less of a growth driver. But we should be a bit more careful about these obituaries that are written about China's participation in the global supply chain. Certainly, we see still exports to the United States, for example, holding up very well, despite some of the tensions on the trade realm that we have seen. In fact, exports from China to the United States, by some numbers, are still running at record levels. And that is because the world needs factory China, particularly in an age of rising inflation, cost pressures everywhere. Chinese producers remain highly competitive, and is that preserves really China's market share. And we therefore think that supply chains may to some extent be redirected potentially to Southeast Asia on the electronic side. But by and large, China's also moving up the value added chain, and you will see some industries being moved to Southeast Asia, South Asia, for example, but China also making inroads in higher value added exports. One example here is the exports of cars and car components, particularly of new energy vehicles, where China will excel. And so, yes, there are certainly headwinds in the year of the tiger, but that shouldn't detract, firstly, from a fairly strong cyclical rebound that we expect over the coming year once China's leadership has a pathway to gradually remove or relax some of these zero COVID restrictions. And the second part really is that what we're witnessing here is a downshift of GDP growth to a probably more sustainable level of 4 to 4.5%, which still at that point would leave China generating far more GDP and incremental growth opportunities than most of the other large global economies in the world. Thank you, Judith.
Thank you, Frederic Neumann there with his comprehensive economic outlook for China. And I took a mental note of what Frederic said there, that China is still the game in town when it comes to investing in Asia, because that's the cue for our next panel discussion, which will discuss the latest investment trends. But first up, I would like to give you a few reference points, because as we know, since last year's China Finance Forum, regulators have continued to expand those access channel and the investment scope for foreign investors in China, well beyond those well-established programs such as Stock Connect and Bond Connect and the CIBM Direct. Just two further developments that I'd like to contribute. In autumn last year, key commodity and stock market derivatives were opened up for qualified foreign investors, and also the Wealth Management Connect went live. And in July this year, ETFs, currency swaps, and interest rate hedging tools got added to the list. So this widening scope for foreign investors is only one aspect, of course, that is shaping those investment trends, because they're also being transformed, of course, by digital innovation, by the savviness of certain demographic groups, think Generation Z, and also new opportunities such as pension markets. All of this will be addressed by our next panel. And as moderator, I have the pleasure to welcome back to the China Finance Forum Marc-André Bechet, Deputy Director General of the Association of the Luxembourg Fund Industry, also known as ALFI. Good to have you back with us, Marc-André, and over to you and your panel.
Thank you very much, Judith, for your very kind words of introductions, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. Thanks to LFF for having me. I have the pleasure of moderating a panel of excellent speakers today. I'd like to briefly introduce them. David Guo is based in Shanghai. He's the China CEO of Schroders. We have Dr. Li based in Shanghai. She's a Deputy General Manager of Fullgoal Fund and also the MD of Fullgoal Asset Management based in Hong Kong. Tao Lin is based in Beijing. He's the head of Overseas Non-Bank Institution Division at the China Construction Bank. And last but not least, we have Desiree Wang, based in Hong Kong, who is the MD and the China Country Manager at JP Asset Management. So really experts in the field based in China and in Hong Kong. Not surprisingly, the first question is really on the distribution landscape. What do we see happening in China? Is it something which is still very much bank-driven? Do we see newcomers? We know that the new generation is tech-savvy, so do young investors use other channels and technologies that would slightly endanger the position of banks in China in distribution of funds? And last but not least, turning to the international audience, looking at the Chinese market, are there any lessons learned from the way you position yourself in order to be really successful in this market? And I'd like to direct the question first to Tao, and then Desiree, you will take over on this one, please.
Well, good morning and good afternoon to audiences and fellow panelists. Thank you for the question, Mark. In terms of the fund distribution channels, what we have in China are very much like the setup as in the EU countries. An individual can choose to make his or her fund investment through direct selling channels such as fund companies or through fund agents such as banks, brokers, and third-party platforms. And if you ask a Chinese person where he or she bought their first mutual fund, a middle-aged person like me probably would tell you over banks' counters. And however, individuals from Generation Z or millennials will probably tell you on smartphone apps. Frankly speaking, the distribution landscape has definitely been evolving over the years due to demographical, social, and technology changes. And it is definitely not a bank-driven business like 20 years ago. Tech companies like Alipay and Tencent have joined the competition in recent years, and they offer a full range of funds through WeChat, Alipay, which are some of the most frequently used social media and e-payment apps in China at very low cost. And they have experienced a barbaric growth over the last few years due to a lack of sufficient oversight. If we look at the proportion of non-money market public funds booking under agent distribution channels in the period of 2017 to third quarter this year, that proportion from banks has dropped from 70% to 49% in comparison with that of third-party platforms and increased from 11% to 33%. However, most of the large banks are counter-reacting by embedding current trends into their cross-selling strategy, online distribution models, and smartphone apps. Take our bank, China Construction Bank, for example. We serve 730 million retail customers. That's like the half of population of China, with over 14,000 banking branches across China. With a strong customer base, all-in-one banking app, physical presence, and comprehensive financial service capabilities, it gives the bank the edge to build long-term comparative advantage over other distribution channels. At the end of the day, or in the long term, the ability to understand the market, meet clients' financial needs at different life stages, provide suitable asset allocation and advisory service while making risk-adjusted returns are the most important factors to achieve sustainable growth. And on the other hand, many of the market participants I spoke to do expect that President Xi's Common Prosperity Initiative will bring new opportunities to the fund industry. The average proportion of Chinese household financial assets is roughly at 30%, and it is expected to have a 9% annual growth rate, and the market volume will reach 320 trillion RMB by the end of 2025. And also, China's middle-income population will probably double from 400 million to 800 million in the next 10 to 15 years. And that being said, I believe the wealth management industry or the fund industry in China will grow into a pie which is big enough for everyone to share, and that includes international asset managers. So my suggestion for international asset managers entering China is to find a reliable strategic partner and come up with fund products that considers specific financial needs of Chinese investors. Last year, BlackRock and CCB, we set up a wealth management JV company in Shanghai, and it does benefit from BlackRock's expertise in investment and risk management, as well as CCB's knowledge of local market, client-based national distribution network, and fund custody service, and other domestic resources as well. I think David and Desiree from Schroders and JP Morgan Asset can back up my point. And I know both companies have set up their wealth management units in China by forming partnerships with Chinese banks. Also, when offering financial products in the Chinese market, foreign asset managers should really consider the specific needs of Chinese market and the investors, instead of just simply copy and paste what they have on the shelf. Mark.
Over to you, Desiree. Thank you.
I think Mark has already almost spoken most of the talking points I want to share with the audience. But what I want to echo is banks used to be dominant, as what Tom mentioned, and now the bank-driven model is going to becoming more and more diverse. So Tao spent time on the digital platform, which is also part of the thing that I want to highlight. But on top of that, we also see security companies, like the brokerage companies. They are also a rising power in the mutual fund distribution landscape in China. They are going through their own reform or their own transition into the wealth management business. So security company becoming more and more important, another important distribution partner for mutual fund company on the ground. And also we cannot ignore another channel, which is a third party, some of the third party wealth management platform, etc. So anyway, so most of the landscape change, evolution is exactly what Tao has been sharing with us. And on the international lesson side, I have to echo Tao again, because he mentioned the importance of a local partner. That's also a point I want to make, and thank you for make reference to JP Morgan, Schroders, etc. We do see the importance of having a local partner, and it is very important if we want to say that any lessons or any experience we want to share with international partners. Because China has so many things that you have to remember that it's you need to respect local. So I think the top one principle for us is to respect local in all different aspects, and find a local partner may be step one, but in your day-to-day business practice, you need to know how the local clients demand, which and investment behavior, which could be so different from our international experience. I took a small example like the digital platform, which Tao has mentioned, have spent quite a time on. It's a digital platform like Tencent, like Ant Financial, like Tiantian, those fund supermarkets. They are developing on their own right, because based upon they've been responding so fast and adapt to the local clients, retail clients, online clients, Generation Z's investment behavior and demand. So there is almost zero precedent example for them to copy from internationally. So when international managers like us to come in, operate in this market, and when we're working with them, and we analyze how the online behavior is, we need to learn how to work together with our platform partner to attract flows from the online clients. And don't forget, you are attracting, and everybody on that platform are competing for the flows against dozens of or hundreds of other fund management companies or other product providers. So there are a lot of the specific online method of attracting those flows, get them to pay attention to your company, to your brand, before they can pay attention to specific products you want to promote on that platform. So there are a lot of the things that you never experience, you never come across with in your international market. So I think number one is we do need to know the market is so local, and in a lot of business, there are a lot of local practice. If you really want to run a commercially successful business here, you're going to learn those local practice, work with a local partner, and respect the locality, saying less and less about this is how we do in US, this is how we do in Europe, and learn how we do business in China.
We got the message, Desiree and Tao, that we come first to you and look for advice before doing anything in terms of distribution channel. So thank you so much. You use actually two words. I think, Desiree, you said behavior, and Tao, you use the word sustainable growth. So that brings me actually to the second question, which is on sustainability. And it's not a rhetoric question, it's something which is really mission critical. We'd like to understand in China, among retail investors, what is the mindset on sustainability, on sustainable finance issues? Is it something which is really very present? How do people react? Do they have any preferences in terms of selecting products because of sustainability issues? And I think that, David, you wanted to cover that question, please.
Thank you, Marc-André. You ask a very good question. I believe many of you are sharing the same view with me. If many years ago, there was a period of asset management 1.0, return was the only objective for investors. than in asset management 2.0. Investors included risk factors and sought for risk-adjusted returns. So now we see sustainability driving asset management industry towards a new era, asset management 3.0, in which our investors will actively take into sustainability factors and assess impact-adjusted returns for their investment one day. At first, sustainable investment was only recognized by institutional investors in China. Just a few years back, ESG investment was a kind of gestures for those institutional investors who want to align with policy guidance from regulators or attract more attention from capital markets. But now we see positive changes, particularly on the retail side in China, since more ESG factors have been found to be effectively used to hedge risk or capture alpha, along with the application of their original meanings. So in China, fund houses start to test water on ESG by providing ESG-themed mutual funds 10 years ago. Then it has turned out that many of their investment performances have been reasonably improved. Many retail investors who invest in these funds have enjoyed the sustainable theme-related alpha since, and started to buy in ESG concepts and try to learn sustainable investment more. So for many retail investors, after 10 years of evolution, sustainable investment has been associated with long-term investment, and it has raised investors' awareness for environmental protection and social responsibilities. ESG thematic funds launched in China reflect this evolvement and also speak for retail investors' attitude. So from 2010 to 2020, over 10 years' time, there were only around 10 ESG-themed mutual funds launched per year. It was a period of investors' education. However, over the last 2 years, fund houses has launched 60 to 70 ESG mutual funds per year, which demonstrate retail investors' awareness and demands to sustainable investment raised. Another interesting observation is that a few years ago, retail investors may only knew the environmental thematic funds, focusing on E only. For example, green bond funds, climate change funds, energy transition funds that are only related to a green economy theme. But now, environmental, social, and governance all come under the spotlight. And more importantly, the assessment framework to each of E, S, and G are increasingly sophisticated. For instance, we see 17 ESG active funds launched in 2022. If we check their ESG assessment factors, 13 funds look into companies' environmental behaviors, and another 13 funds will assess companies' salary level and staff well-being. 11 funds will focus on the independence of the board, compensation, and the incentive plan for the management. We can see the assessment factors have become more in line with international practices. So as an early mover and the ESG leading asset manager, Schroders has completed firm-wide ESG full integration across our managed assets and has also developed proprietary ESG assessment tools covering 130,000 companies globally. In China market, we have set up a bank wealth management joint venture this year, as mentioned by Tao and Desiree, and a plan to set up a wholly foreign-owned fund management company for our local-to-local market. We're keen to bring our global ESG best practices to local market through our onshore platforms. Marc-André, back to you.
Thank you, David. I'm really glad to see that this is something which is top of the agenda in China as well. And on that front, I think we have more convergences than divergences. Now, I'm not an expert in retail investors in China, but I did a bit of homework, and it was my understanding that retail investors have a limited choice, if I may say, rather invest in Chinese equity and Chinese bonds. But wondering whether there are any options and avenues that would permit a retail investor in China to diversify beyond these Chinese equity and bonds. And for that question, I would like to get Dr. Li's advice, please.
Thank you, Mark. In terms of financial investment, yes, indeed, other than, the Chinese investors are not only limited to bonds and equities in investment. So currently the market for Chinese equities is about 100 trillion yuan. And among this, about 45% or about 45 trillion are held by retail investors. In the bond market, the current bond market value is about 130 trillion RMB yuan, but it's mainly held by institutional investors with little by retail investors. But other than these two standard financial investments, we have a booming public fund industry. And within the public funds industry, we have created products that goes a whole array of different products offered to retail investors in China. For example, the money market funds, the total market value right now is about 9.5 trillion. Among it, about 60% are held by retail investors. For the equity funds, which include not only active funds, but also passive funds and the ETFs and the index funds, etc. The total value is about 8.5 trillion, and about 70 to 80% of them are held by retail investors. And for bond funds, the current market value is about 6.5 trillion. About 15% of that value is held by retail investors. And we also have fourth fund of fund funds is currently about 200 billion in market value, but almost all of them are held by retail investors. And for commodity funds, the current market value is about 50 billion. About 50% of them are held by retail investors. So in sum, for Chinese retail investors, they currently hold about 45 trillion in stocks, 6 trillion in money market funds, 6 trillion in equity funds in all forms, 1 trillion in bond funds, 200 billion in FOF, and 50 billion in commodity funds. So this whole array of products provide a whole spectrum of risk-return characteristics that can meet different risk appetites, holding preferences, investment qualifications, etc., for management of liquidity, risk diversification, value preservation, or capital appreciation. So back to your question, yes, we are making our effort to provide more and more investment vehicles for our retail investors here.
Thank you, Dr. Li. It's actually more diversified than I thought. It's a very complete overview. Thank you so much. We have two questions on inbound and outbound investments. And the first one is rather looking at investing in China. We know that China has been striving to open up its capital markets to global investors over the past years. And some challenges available for investors with restrictions or without restrictions. And I'd like specifically to look at the private asset side of things, so private equity, private debt, and real estate. I'd like to hear Tao on that, any views and trends on how for investors access the market, and yes, what is available in terms of investment opportunities in today's world.
Yes, Mark, as you and Judith have mentioned, over the past decade, China has been opening up its capital market to global investors at a steady pace. And you can see Chinese regulators have been putting out tremendous efforts on measures to facilitate foreign investors. Less paperwork and lower time frame for initial setup, extension of tax exemption for bond investor to 2025, widening of investable assets such as commodity futures, and the removal of limits on number of security brokers, etc. All these measures have been positively received by the market and the investors. And currently, there are multiple channels for foreign investors to participate in China's capital market. Each of them has its own features and dedicated investment targets to meet investors' different investment needs and preferences. First, for bond investment, there are CIBM Direct and Bond Connect. CIBM Direct is an onshore trading scheme and preferred by central banks and large financial institutions. And on the other hand, Bond Connect is an offshore bond trading arrangement between Hong Kong and China's mainland bond market infrastructures and preferred by commercial investors. Second, for stock investment, there are Stock Connect and QFI, where Stock Connect is quite similar to Bond Connect. Investors can buy and sell selected A-share stocks via Hong Kong, where QFI covers almost all onshore public traded stocks. Now, on top of that, QFI can also do margin trading and invest in bond, private investment funds, and derivatives. The investment quota on QFI has been lifted and access threshold has been further lowered in recent years, and it has almost no restriction on capital injection and repatriation while enjoying favorable tax treatment. No value-added tax for capital gain, only 10% of income tax for the cash, interest, and dividends. However, none of the above really gives the global investor the access to invest in private assets. The channel to do that is QFLP, which stands for Qualified Foreign Limited Partner. A foreign investor needs to set up a QFLP fund manager in China or invest as a limited partner in a QFLP fund set up or managed by other fund managers. The first QFLP pilot program started in Shanghai in 2011 and now has expanded to 21 provinces or cities. By now, the total investment amount in Shanghai has already exceeded 40 billion RMB, and some of the well-known international asset managers are Carlyle, Blackstone, SoftBank, Oaktree Capital, and Schroders, etc. An investor can enjoy the flexibility to invest in PEs, non-performing assets, mezzanine debts, debt to equity swaps, and VC funds. And it's rather consistent with that of domestic PE funds. And however, if you compare QFLP to the other channels, the setup of QFLP is a little bit more complicated. Overseas investors are demanding a one-stop shop approach with a single simplified process from local providers to help them tackle the Chinese regulatory and commercial environment as they enter and expect into the market. And that's where we can come in to help. And CCB is a full licensed financial group, has a wholly owned subsidiary which actively participating in China's private asset market, and also as a leading custodian bank, we have assisted many investors to apply the appropriate QFLP programs in China. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Tao. It's very extensive. I'd like to leverage what you said, and as well you did in her introduction. So we know that policymakers in China had a very structured way of opening up their markets for inbound and outbound investments. And you mentioned a few schemes, but from a retail investor perspective from China, we saw the QDI up to today, the Greater Bay Area Regional Development Scheme. So these are schemes which permit retail investors to diversify beyond Chinese assets. Now I'm turning to Dr. Li, and my question is not entirely neutral because I represent the fund industry in Luxembourg, but do you think that retail investors in China would benefit from a greater access to non-domestic funds?
Yes, absolutely. So for retail investors and basically any investors, a simple way to effectively improve the overall return to risk portfolio is to diversify their investment strategies. As we know that all domestic assets have a relatively high correlation, so by diversification into the non-domestic assets can definitely improve investors' risk-return profiles. We know that in the US, about 30% of equity investment are invested internationally, but within China, the QDII, as you mentioned, is about low single digit in percentage in China's investment. But the trend is good. The trend is going upward. So I will mention a few of the channels that have been opening up and is under implementation. So the first opening up channel was QDII. It was opened in 2006. So in the first year of its being opened up, there was only like 1 billion in RMB yuan in investment in QDII when it first opened. But 5 years ago, the number became 80 billion RMB yuan. And by the end of last year, the number became 240 billion yuan. So quite a lot of change. And another very successful opening up channel was the mainland Hong Kong Stock Connect. The Connect was launched in 2014. In the first year, there was 10 billion RMB yuan that transferred between the Connect. And then 5 years ago, the number became 600 billion RMB yuan. By the end of last year, the number became 2 trillion RMB yuan. Again, a very steep upward trend. And then another channel that was opened up recently in the last few years was the mainland Hong Kong mutual funds mutual recognition. It was launched in 2015. The first year, it was only 60 million. And by the end of the last year, it was 15 billion. And then, as you mentioned, last year, the Greater Bay Area Regional Development Scheme was launched. It was launched in September of last year. And by September of this year, about 1 year, about the total AUM, the total value of the transfer of funds was 1.6 billion RMB yuan, and about more than 50 accounts were opened through the scheme. And according to a survey by HSBC, 80% of the respondents of the survey said that they would increase their use of the scheme in the near future. So in sum, it is widely recognized that there is a great benefit for the retail investors to invest abroad. And also more channels are being opened up in the last 10, 20 years, and especially last a few years. And also more investors are getting interested in investing, to consider investing abroad or are investing abroad. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Li. I take from what you said that the trend is positive and the market is still opening up. And I can tell you there's a huge appetite for international asset managers to tap into this market. And of course, for you retail investors to get that exposure to non-domestic assets. So good to know. Thank you so much. Now I'm turning to the last question, which is a recurring question. I think across the world, nearly all jurisdictions have that issue of the funding of pensions. We know that the first pillar, the state pillar, will probably not do in a number of markets. And we're turning to solutions like second pillars and third pillars. So individual contributions and or employers' contributions to fund the gap on pensions. And that is a problem that will be becoming even more crucial going forward. I looked at the Chinese market a few times, and we'd like to hear your views on what you see happening on the second and third pillars, and also whether there would be any opportunity for funds to be underlyings of these pension funds. Because if you look at some markets like in Latin America, very often local pension funds use UCITS or other non-domestic funds to diversify investments and get exposure for a certain portion of the investments to non-domestic assets. So that could be an avenue as well for international asset managers to offer their services by way of funds that will underlie these second or third pillars. I think that we had two of you interested in that question. Desiree, if you'd like to get first, and then David would add a few words as well. Desiree.
Sure. So before I start, maybe I don't know how much our audience understand China's pension system. Very quick, like most of the countries, China has 3 pillars, as Mark just mentioned, plus a national pension fund as a strategic reserve fund. And overall, there are different calculations of the size, but the more popular number quoted for the overall size of the industry 3 pillars plus national pension fund adds up to $1.3 trillion. And China's problem is over-reliance on pillar 1, which is correctly pointed out by Mark. And we know that in the US, the pillar 1 probably take only 8% of the whole pension system. China's pillar 1 takes more than 50%, the number being declining because of rising the growth of the pillar 2, which are enterprise annuity and occupational annuity sector. So in terms of the trend, what we are seeing is you can easily tell from the data, from the phenomena I just described, that we need to grow Pillar 2 and Pillar 3. So Pillar 2 has observed very rapid growth over the past 5 years. Is the most rapid growth over the past 5 years, so taken up a bigger and a bigger share of the pension system. I want to focus a little bit more on Pillar 3, the private retirement industry. Actually, the Pillar 3 wasn't existent yet, because we are still waiting for China to build a complete ecosystem, regulatory framework, policy framework for the individual retirement account to be set up. You probably heard a lot of the private retirement, there are a lot of headline news because China was making steady progress in building our own third pillar and individual retirement system by announcing some of the rules in April, and people are waiting for more detailed rule to flesh out the regulation which come out in recent weeks. And there is a lot of actions and a lot of much expected action from the country. And this is going to be a lot of opportunity for fund management company, asset management industry, because in the potentially to be set up very soon to be set up individual retirement system, there would be 4 products that's eligible to become retirement products that can fall into this tax incentive retirement framework, which include bank deposits, but specifically bank deposits for retirement purpose, bank wealth management products, insurance products, retirement insurance products, as well as mutual funds. And in the first stage, current stage, the mutual funds that's eligible for the third pillar retirement purpose are target date fund and a target risk fund, which a lot of fund management company had been launching over the past 5 years, preparing ourselves for the coming individual retirement system, including our joint venture, very own joint venture onshore in China, CIFM as well. And in terms of the product preference, we've been looking at, because Chinese investors, their behavior probably not sure whether they are willing to put aside their money into a product and the money will be locked up there for a longer period. So there is a lot of debate and analysis on the ground that we think maybe at the start stage of the retirement of the third pillar retirement, the low risk and a short duration, relatively shorter duration products would be more popular at the beginning, especially when we're talking about a very long-term lockup type of products like 10-year, or your target date fund designed for 2045, which is like more than 10 years away from today. How many retail investors would be really convinced to lock up their money? This is one side. The other side is not many, almost very few, or if not none, onshore managers have the track record to prove their TDF the track record of the 10-year like TDF, because even none of the TDF products onshore has more than 5-year track record yet. So basically, this is still a long journey for us to go. Definitely, JP Morgan, through our joint venture, want to be the early participants into this game, because retirement is always a key theme in every country's mutual fund industry. It means a lot for us, but we also realize that the competition we are facing, not only from our competitors, meaning other fund management companies, could include David's like Schroders and others onshore business, but also we are facing competition for products from banks, insurance companies, bank wealth management subsidiaries, etc. As I mentioned, that those are all providing products, and their products could be more with more certainty or more type of guarantee than mutual funds provided by mutual fund companies. So those is a close trend we are closely focusing on the tracking. Of course, in the long run, because the third pillar, individual retirement, which products you choose going to be individual choice. So we think that investment performance in future would be a key success factor, whether mutual fund companies, including us, including Schroders, including all the onshore other local players, whether we can provide a stable and convincing performance and track record for Chinese retail investors that are coming into the retirement space, or even in 10 years or whatever, we can prove to them that invest for the long run is the right thing they should do, instead of just saving, put money in the deposits for their retirement purpose. So this is a journey, going to be a challenging journey for all of us asset managers to go through. So we look at this less as a short-term flow story, but more like long-term strategic, disruptive kind of an industry trend. And we also really think this is important, because when we talk about a lot of the retail investors' behavior, one key thing is we want more and more investors invest for long term. And retirement is an important long-term investment objective. So we want more and more people come to invest for long term, and less so for invest for becoming like overnight becoming richer because of the trading, the successful trading strategy, etc. Anyway, I will pause here and make sure that David would have sufficient supplementary points to add on my my whatever. Yeah. Thank you. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Desiree. I think you already, thank you for taking the bulk of the, the task of explaining it very thorough details, right? So this is very comprehensive already. So I have no disagreement at all. I think we are at the right moment of witnessing a regime change, right, for the Pillar 3 system. So basically, officially, right, there's several regulators, Ministry of Human Resources, Social Security, Ministry of Finance, CBRC, CSRC, State Tax Administration jointly published the final version, right, of these overarching rule governing the Pillar 3 schemes. And simultaneously, right, 3 other relevant policies are released, covering banks' participation, mutual fund qualification, implementation of tax incentives. So in each industry, in bank industry, in the mutual fund industry, the forces are joined together, right, to roll out these, these individual pension systems with significant impact to various sectors, right, across finance industry. So my observation, right, further to Desiree's comments earlier, is that now it seems that a bank will act both as account manager and a product provider. So this is a critical role for assessing clients and potentially directing pension flows into bank management products. Fund houses, as a product provider, right, will be expected to provide more sophisticated investment capabilities to address the specific pension demands for retail investors via diversified product range, right? Those type of products, as mentioned by Desiree, right? Target date funds, or we also have diversified growth funds, for example, the solutions for UK and the European pension investment need. Right, so this will be, creating a very competitive market into this pension, market in China. Well, it's interesting to know that, like given the new Pillar 3 system has been targeting to commence in 2023, we're seeing the local banks and fund houses are working, speeding up to get ready, and the progress is very fast. Like, for example, the first batch of 28 fund houses already completed testing connectivity of their back office systems with a central tax deferral pension clearing infrastructure. the first batch of 40 pension fund of funds have been whitelisted. On the bank side, the individual pension wealth management platform across the whole banking industry has also been announced technically ready. So what does it mean to global investors like us? I totally agree with Mark and Desiree's observation, and I think Dr. Li also mentioned that. We see, actually, in this pension investment side, right? Most individual pension products in the market are still quite homogeneous. Although they're called pension products or retirement products, the product features and the management methods are not too different from other type of funds, right? All contained in the domestic market. So, going forward, the global diversification across different asset classes, this will be the very important features and also those capabilities that global asset management firms like us can bring on board. Right. So for us, we also envision ourselves, to go along both the bank's wealth management market by, introducing pension product services through our joint venture with Bank of Communications on the bank investment side. And also we continue to explore the opportunities to bring our global capabilities on pension through our future wholly owned fund management company. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you, David. It was an extensive response. Sorry to cut you off. We covered much ground today. We have still one question to all of you, and I would really ask you to be very sharp. 30 seconds, please. How do you see the evolution of the Chinese retail investors market for 2023 and beyond? I'd like to start with the ladies first, so perhaps Desiree and then Dr. Li. Then we have Tao and then David. Just a few words of how you see things going on in 2023. Desiree.
Sorry, I thought David first. Anyway, yeah, I'm not sure whether I can finish this in 30 seconds, try my best. I think 2023, with a gradual relaxation, I don't know how you feel it from sitting on the ground in Shanghai, in China, gradual relaxation of COVID policies has already hugely boosted the market sentiment. So equity market was rallying and the bond market was falling in the past couple of days. So people stay bullish for 2023, and whether this will shift to an equity-friendly market environment, probably we don't know. This is a question that we keep debating every day. I know that here we want to share with everybody a word of conclusion. I probably have 3 words of a caution. Number 1 is never underestimate how competitive the local industry is. Even though the global players, none of us has been super big, but the local players already very strong. It's a crowded market, highly competitive, over 150 fund management companies on the ground, over 10,000 mutual funds. So don't estimate the competitiveness of the local industry before you coming here. And second, I would say don't be judgmental, showing empathy. Don't say, oh, Chinese investors, they are like this, or they are like, understand why they behave like this, understand their demand if you want to have a great successful business here. And the number 3 is focus on client experience. I found that I've been working at JP Morgan for more than 15 years. And China local market, everybody was so focused on client experience. And when I look at some of the local fund management companies, their manager dashboard, there is one metric looking at a percentage of the clients satisfied with their products. And so we focus on clients and client focus and understand them that to make sure that we can do better here. Hopefully I answer your question. Thank you, Mark.
Desiree. Thank you, Desiree. Over to you, Dr. Li, please, for a few words as well.
So with China, the economy is still growing and the interest rates are going low. So just, beyond 2023 and going forward, we generally have a positive outlook for the near future. Well, in terms of the mutual fund industry in particular, so currently the mutual fund industry in China is about 23% of its GDP, whereas in the US is more than 100% of its GDP. So there's still a big room there to be fulfilled. And in terms of what are the areas that I see as key areas of development, I'd say three. The first, mutual, as some of the guests earlier mentioned today, the pension products, especially the pension FOF, that goes with the third pillar of the pension. And then secondly, what we call is fixed income plus, which combines the stable income with slightly active strategies. And thirdly, just equity in general, both beta and alpha, both have opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Li. Up to you, Tao. Your turn, please.
All right. Well, I think despite of the unprecedented uncertainties in all aspects, China has demonstrated a strong economic potential and resilience. At the end of third quarter, China's GDP has managed to rise by 3.9%. And I believe that 2023 will be a pretty good year for China, as the economy is expected to optimize COVID measures and domestic consumption rebounds. My forecast for nominal GDP will be roughly at 8%. Real GDP will be around at 5%. And in the long term, as China's capital market continues to grow and open up, and there are huge market potential in the fund industry. And I think China is more than happy to share the future opportunities with international asset managers from Luxembourg, EU countries, and the world. And of course, the CCB as a leading custodian bank, a major market maker and participant in domestic capital market, together with our CCB Europe team, which headquartered in Luxembourg with office throughout continent Europe, are willing to provide the best on-ground support and one-stop solution for international investors who are eager to access China's capital market. And last thing to keep in mind, but not the least, it is important to acknowledge uncertainties surrounding China's economy and market performance while maintaining an active approach to investing at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tao. David, you've got the privilege of the last word of conclusion.
Thank you. Very quickly, Marc-André, in my view, a current market valuation may open up opportunities again next year and beyond. Growth assets and risky assets, which could benefit from the long-going structural growth in China. Secondly, we see two major markets in the asset management industry here: public mutual fund market and the bank's wealth management market, where they have different investors with different risk appetite. In public funds market, active equity products and the growth-oriented multi-asset products will thrive over longer term, while lower risk multi-asset products, or what we call fixed income plus products, will serve the bulk of the investment appetite for banks' wealth management market in the considerable years ahead. Finally, I expect long-term, low to medium volatility products will have great potential for the pension market. Thank you.
Well, it was a fascinating discussion. I learned a lot. Thank you so much for being so well prepared. I'm really honored to have such a panel of distinguished experts. I hope the audience enjoys. Thanks for listening to us. And back to you, Judith, for the next edition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marc-André, Bechet there, and his panel speakers, Dr. Xiaowei, David Gould, Tao Lin, and Desiree Wang. And I heard somewhat an echo there in the undertones and the outlooks that were discussed of what Jörg Wuttke described earlier as China's comeback gene. Now, our next session will expand on a topic Tao Lin has just touched upon, and that's private equity investing. And the topic, indeed, for our next session is, in a bit of a broader context, alternative investments in China and in Asia. And to give you a reference point there, according to Bloomberg data, China's private equity and venture capital funds managed a total of just under $2 trillion as of July last year, which means the volume has tripled pretty much since 2016 and indeed has become the world's second largest. And to lead this session, I have the pleasure to hand you over to another familiar face for the audience of the China Finance Forum, coming to us from Singapore, Stephane Karolczuk. He's, of course, partner at Arendt and Medernach and head of their Hong Kong office. It's a shame you can't be with us here in Luxembourg at this time. Pleasure to have you back here with us. Over to you, Stephane.
Well, thank you very much, Judith, for the very kind introduction, and to all of you for attending this China Finance Forum 2022. This fireside chat will focus on challenges and opportunities in Asia for alternative investment fund managers and investors. As we all know, markets worldwide have been shaken by an unprecedented series of events over the past 3 years. As far as Asia is concerned, part of the region have already reopened, whilst other parts are progressively reopening. Markets have been shaken as well, and the region is subject to a number of geopolitical tensions. Now seems to be the time for a correction and for dealing with a number of side effects of the pandemics itself and the measures taken during the pandemics, as well as the long-term consequence thereof, in particular inflation and risk of recessions in a number of economies. Whilst the demand for traditional and alternative investment products have been extremely high during the pandemics, boosting valuation, it seems now that investors are a bit less willing to trade liquidity for returns and certainly more selective as to their allocation geographically. Yet, in these challenging times, opportunities are available for agile and savvy asset managers and for their investors, in particular in Asia. I'm very pleased to have Frederic Azemard, managing partner of TR Capital, with us today to chat on this topic. Thank you, Frederic, for being with us. TR Capital is a secondaries investment firm in Asia, which provides liquidity solution to private equity investors and is an active investor and shareholder. The firm is independent. It's been created back in 2008. It has offices in Hong Kong, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Mumbai, and just opened an office in Singapore, where I had the great pleasure to meet Frederic yesterday. And as far as I know, Frederic is on its way now to China to visit its business over there. So Frederic, thank you again. Could you tell us a bit more about you, as well as TR Capital and its activities in Asia?
Thank you, Stephane, for this introduction, and it's a pleasure to be part of this forum. So my name is Frederic Azemard. I'm, as you said, one of the 3 partners of TR Capital. Let me give you a bit of background on TR Capital. We started TR Capital back in 2008, and the strategy at the beginning has been the same, which is investing in innovative companies in Asia. If we look back in 2008, you had a very large number of private equity firms that were being raised and that we are competing against. And at the same time, the secondary market was growing in Europe and in the US. And we thought the secondary market was really an opportunity in Asia because there was no player there. So we became the first player to do secondaries in Asia. The market was very small. It was very early. And we got a little bit of help by the global financial crisis that generated some stress, some need of liquidity, and that really gave us the jump start we needed to start TR Capital. Now, if we look 14 years afterwards, we are a team of 30 people, as you said, across 5 offices: Hong Kong, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Mumbai, and we just recently opened Singapore. We've completed 40 transactions, and we have 1.2 billion of AUM across 5 funds, Fund 5 that we're currently finished to raise and investing.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. More specifically on secondaries, I mean, people know private equity, but secondaries is a little bit more special, obviously, is that you provide liquidity to PE fund managers. Is it common in Asia? I think you already answered part of the question in your introduction, but how about now? So at the start, you were really one of the pioneers there. Has the market changed in this respect? And what are investors looking when investing more specifically in a secondaries fund versus a traditional PE structure?
So the secondary market in Asia is still early in a way, underdeveloped, I would say. Less early, I would put it more underdeveloped. If you look globally, the secondary AUM is about 15% of the global AUM. If you look at Asia only, the secondary AUM is less than 3%. And that's one element. On the other side, the DPI, distribution to paid-in capital, has always been one of the key issues in Asia, meaning in a lot of funds, and I'm sure a lot of investors who are looking at this panel today have experienced that. Fantastic paper return, very nice multiple on paper, but converting paper into real money is complicated. So we are in a situation which is interesting because the DPI issue remains, and it's due to quite a lot of elements in the market that are belong to detail day. And on the other hand, I would say the medication to solve that is still much smaller than you have on the rest of the world, which enabled us to do a few things that probably we would not do, would not be able to do in the US or in Europe. And I just would like to highlight two things on the secondary market, on the secondary strategies. There are really two elements that we look at, or two different types of strategies. First is on the asset themselves. There are two ways to make money. One is to invest in average companies at cheap price. The other one is to invest in good companies at what we consider is a good price. We only look at the second category. The first category for us is end up most of the time being value traps. And so we really focus on these growth, innovative companies where secondaries for us is a way to get access to the companies and where we make our return not on the discount at entry, but really from the value that is generated from the asset. That's very important. It's been working for us, and that's what we've been focusing on. The second dimension of the secondary is the passive versus active. The passive secondary is LP secondary, giving liquidity to an investor at the fund level. And when you do that, when I say you're passive, is that if things don't go according to plan, there is not really much you can do. So we started doing that very early on, and we stopped and moved to something that is direct secondary, where we give liquidity not at the LP level, but at the fund level. So generating liquidity for the fund that then distributes money to the LP. So in a summary, our strategy is active secondaries on good assets.
I see. And how about your exit strategy as a secondaries fund manager?
So most of the exits, about more than 2/3, is close to 75% actually, is really through strategic sales or selling to larger PE funds.
Right.
We tend to take stakes between 5 and 20% in companies on this active secondaries strategy. What I didn't mention also is we also do two types of active secondaries. One is single asset, this where we become shareholders, and the other one is portfolio fund restructuring. But in both cases, we look at very solid companies. So the exit for us is a way, and we do that actually through selling, as I said, to trade sale, doing trade sale, or selling to other PE funds that are larger funds. IPO is about 25% of all our exits. And when we look at that, it should just be the cherry on the cake, right? So the cycles, and we've experienced that, and you've experienced that too, Stephane, are so unpredictable that if you bet 100% of your exit on IPO, it's very risky. Investing for us on these quality assets, growing innovative companies, is also one way to generate or at least have options to get liquidity. Again, there is always interest, and we've even experienced that. We were having our investor day in Singapore 2 days ago, and we explained to our investors that even in the current environment and in China, quite a lot of our portfolio companies are still going to up rounds. And when they do up rounds, this gives you opportunity to sell part of your shares. So focusing on quality assets will always, or should most of the time, give you opportunities to generate liquidity. And that's what we are looking for.
That's right. Well, thank you for that. And specifically now, we're talking about good assets at a good price, right? So what in this current market environment, what are the main opportunities for TR Capital as a leading secondaries Asia-based manager? And what are the sectors and geographies for which you see the highest potential?
So the sectors, it will be simple. For the one we focus on, remains tech, healthcare, and what we call next generation consumer. So all these innovative companies, this is, regardless of where the economy is, having innovation and growth is really what we are focusing on. The challenge, I would say today, is much more on the geography. And we are focusing on 3 different geographies: China, India, and Southeast Asia. And those 3 have very different dynamics. And let's start with the elephant in the room, which is China. China right now is probably facing its deepest crisis of the last 30 years. The domestic consumption is at a record low. You have unemployment rate of fresh graduates at 20% and more. The Hang Seng fell close to 1997 level, which is 25 years ago. And the consensus against investing in China has never been so high. Now, will China reopen in the first quarter of 2023? No one knows, of course. What we see clearly today is that the valuation are correcting significantly on the listed part and also correcting significantly on the private part, which gives a fantastic entry point. But there is a lot of uncertainty. Now, if China reopens and wants to grow the economy, they can. They have the tools to stimulate the economy that other countries probably today don't really possess anymore. They have one of the lowest debt level with only 47%, I guess, of its GDP. They have one of the lowest inflation rates and very high levels of household savings with close to 115 trillion RMB. So the message for us, and we see that in China, and yes, I'm on my way to China in next Sunday. I actually went twice and spent 3.5 months in China last year. We want to see what's happening on the ground, but the message is simple. The entry point is extremely interesting, but the timing might not be right just yet. But we should not bury China too quickly, and we need to be absolutely ready when and if things are reopening.
Right. Well, thank you for that. So you were saying, so you're buying to PE fund managers, then most of it is through strategic sales or selling to other PE. Small portion of your exit is IPO. Now, do you face now a number of PE managers that if they could, they wouldn't sell because the valuation is not that great, but they have to sell? So does that also create opportunities for you, whether in China or outside China?
No, that's exactly right. And that's exactly what's happening. I would say even more in China than probably on the rest. India is slightly different. India, you have a very growing market, and probably India will be a big beneficiary of the US to China tension, with quite a lot of capital being reallocated to India. But the underlying economy is attractive. You have some very good assets, and valuations are starting to correct. Southeast Asia market is still younger. It's just 10 years old, and secondary market is growing. Now you have one main issue in Southeast Asia is you don't have the IPO structure that you have in China and in India. Mm-hmm. So yes, you're right. Your point on some liquidity need in Asia, clearly right now, especially in China, and this is why we can have access to these very good companies at very attractive price, but we need to be extremely cautious.
Thank you. So now let's look at it from the other angle, more the LP side, and for you, the capital raising. We sometimes quote perception is reality. Is right now, as you said, perception on Asia and certain part of it, and certainly China, is not at its best. What type of investors do you have in your platform? What's the response you get and you got during your last fundraising, whether in the US, whether you're active over there, or Europe or Asia? How would you compare a little bit reaction of LPs to your proposed strategies?
The balance of our LPs today, we have close to 80% who are institutions, 75 to 80%, the rest being large and multi-family offices. And it's quite diversified across geography between Europe, Asia, Middle East, and North America. Now, we started actually fundraising of our Fund 5 mid this year. Target is to raise 600 million. And we did a first close at close to 60% of this, with a very high re-up rate, 90% re-up rate from our existing investors. So I would say in the current environment, yes, investors are extremely skeptical about Asia, but we've been benefiting from good performance in the past and the trust of our existing investors that have been re-upping this time. What is very important for us is today we have close to 350 million of dry powder in an environment that is extremely unstable and dislocated, and we have absolutely no pressure to invest. So we are very aligned because we have a large part of this money which is coming from the team. We have a large part of our own money which is invested in the funds, and we see that as a very good opportunity. We have been talking to quite a lot of new investors also. The dynamic, you're right, is different. Probably US is a bit more cautious these days. Asia, Middle East, a bit more interested, and Europe in the middle. But if you look at investment opportunities right now, whether it's Europe, US, and Asia, there is still, for us, at least we are convinced, there is still positive long-term growth in this part of the world.
Thank you for that. And I guess as for Europe, I mean, one of the funds that you have created, I believe, was a Luxembourg-based structure which you use for your European distribution. I'm raising a little bit my Luxembourg flag here. So how was the process? How did it go for the European part of your fundraising exercise?
Yeah,
more specifically.
Right. We started that with Tier Capital 4, and we were one of the very first actually, to have a dual structure with a Lux structure for a European investor, and he helped significantly because it creates some trust, some comfort, and that's why we've decided to do that again for Tier Capital 5. We believe obviously it adds a bit more complexity in terms of management, but we've also realized that it's something, I think it's really the natural way for quite a lot of European investors, and Luxembourg did something quite smart here to be able to position themselves, because it's just it's a market that will be growing quite fast.
Oh, thanks for that. Appreciate it. Now we're touching a little bit the conclusion here of our chat. It's been extremely informative. Now let's take the 20,000 feet or the 10,000 feet view here on Asia, and let's cover a little bit more PE, VC, private credit. What's your take on the evolution in those other big alternative sectors over the next couple of years?
Looking at the different geographies, actually, if you want to have exposure in Asia, and that's really the question, right? So the question is, some investors don't want to have exposure in Asia, but if you want to have exposure in Asia, obviously difficult for me to say something different, but to me, the two main areas that are interesting are secondaries and credit. The secondaries, of course, because market being dislocated right now, we can see and we anticipate that we'll be in a very good position to invest over the next 1, 2, 3 years in an interesting market. So we hope, and Tier Capital 5 should be one of our best funds, provided we make the right choices, but we are in a very good position. And credit, why? Because there is all this liquidity issue. We launched actually an activity of NAV financing, also to help generating liquidity in Asia for some fund, which is very different from our secondary strategy. It's an independent team, and we've done that because we see the potential and we see the growth. No one is doing that in Asia, and we believe it's an attractive investment opportunity also.
Well, on that very positive note, Frederic, I must thank you very much for spending this time with us. The best of luck to you in your business trip to China. So thank you again. And Judith, over to you.
Thank you so much. Stephane Karolczuk there with his guest, Frederic Azemard. Thank you for this very instructive conversation. I have a feeling that we will revisit alternative investments in China and Asia in the near future. Now, leading on from China's investment trends, we now want to add a deep dive into China's digital ecosystem. With more than 1 billion internet users, yes, you heard that right, of course, China is the largest e-commerce market on the planet. And to give you a reference point, according to Euromonitor, as of 2021, e-commerce penetration accounted for about 30% of retail sales or 6% of the Chinese economy. In North America, e-commerce accounts only for 20% of retail sales or some 3% of GDP. So quite a difference there. But this is not just a story about size. It's also a story about disruption and innovation. So who are the players in this story? What is driving their business model? And crucially, what is driving their international expansion? To answer that question, I have the pleasure to hand you now over to Chris Hollifield. He's the head of business development at Luxembourg for Finance and will lead the next conversation. Good to have you with us, Chris. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Judith, for those words of introduction. I am now delighted to be joined by Rita Liao, who is covers Asia for TechGrunch and has been focused on the how Chinese tech companies are going global for several years now. So thank you very much for joining us today, Rita.
Great to be here.
Maybe just to begin with a little domestic history, if you will. From around the turn of the millennium, there's been a really big growth in e-commerce firms domestically in China, which today has obviously manifested in what we collectively know as Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, the BAT firms. These firms have a really fundamental role on the lifestyle of everyday Chinese people. So maybe you could walk us through how they, over such a short period of time, how they got to where they are today and how they got big so fast.
Sure, yeah. So they all started around the early 2000s. And you got to remember that China at the time, the internet industry was really, really basic. And so when they started, these three companies, they obviously had their own success stories. But I think the overarching theme is that they were building the internet infrastructure for China at the time. So you start from Baidu, which was building search, which became how people look for information in the early internet days, to Alibaba, who was helping retailers to sell online, to Tencent. It's just building the basic communication channel for people. And the way they started, I would say there are two things, like how they acquire users and how they found their cash cow. And because they were building these basic ways that will eventually change people's lives. Once they found a cash cow, it's really hard to disrupt their market position. That being said, we can talk about Baidu a bit later, because I think of all these three, Baidu's business model, search, is the most prone to technological disruption. Basically, the way that people look up information changed from search to algorithm-driven recommendations, like TikTok and Pinduoduo and others. So that's internal, like how they found this very core need, this core infrastructure for the early internet. But I think externally, it's also important to mention that for a long time, up until the recent years, the Chinese government had quite a relaxed approach towards the industry. It was just let these three companies, and along with other internet giants, grow without much regulatory scrutiny. Just to give an example, at one point, Tencent held over 80% of China's digital music library resources. And it wasn't until recent years that the government said that that's not right and we need to fix it. So I think it's a combination of finding a very core essential user case plus the laissez-faire regulatory environment.
Okay, so really, I mean, we're talking about kind of like a greenfield approach, both in terms of new services and then also in terms of kind of like the regulatory environment in which they find themselves. Now, obviously, the Chinese market is very big and is a great home market, shall we say? But I would imagine that at some stage these firms started to look internationally. What were their kind of first moves in that kind of respect? How did they first get started in internationalization, and was it a success?
Yeah, I guess it depends on how you define success. For example, I think Alibaba was global from day one. It started being a marketplace for Chinese wholesale retailers to ship their goods to the West, to all over the world. But can you describe it as a successful localized effort by Alibaba? I wouldn't say so. It was just bringing what was done traditionally, this international trade, onto e-commerce. It was a relatively low effort global expansion, if you can say this global expansion, compared to what the likes of TikTok and Shein are doing these days. So that was one. And you also got to remember that like China was still years behind Silicon Valley in the early days. There's still much talk about copy to China. So WeChat is a copy of what was like WhatsApp and Alibaba, Amazon. So you can always find these equivalents in China. And so what they were exporting to the outside of China wasn't particularly innovative. So for instance, WeChat tried to expand into the US and the West overall around 2013, and even opened an office in the US, but it never really took off. And I think just from some industry experts' observation, I think WeChat wasn't, I'm not sure how much effort it put into localization, but just from the result, it felt like it didn't really understand the habits of Western users. Just to give one example, I think there's one feature in WeChat that will really annoy a lot of Westerns, which is the voice message. On WhatsApp, you can slide, you can fast forward the voice message, and it tells you how long it is, and you continue playing even if you exit WhatsApp. But on WeChat, you only have one chance. You play it, and then it continues to play. If you stop it, you have to come back, and it's just really annoying. So I think it's all these minor details that I think WeChat kind of missed what Western users' habits are, which explain why it just didn't take off.
Yeah, so there was kind of a failure of localization maybe we can say, or a lack of understanding of potentially some of the importance of some of the cultural factors in terms of just taking a Chinese product and then giving it to an international user base. So how have they adapted their approaches on the basis of these, shall we say, somewhat tentative early attempts?
Yeah, so I think it's unfair to say that all of their international expansion efforts have failed. They've adapted, and they're generally if you look at their efforts outside of China, it's either to the West, the more developed markets, or emerging markets. And I think in the emerging markets, like Southeast Asia particularly, because it's culturally closer to China, these giants have more greater success in expanding there. So to take Tencent, for example, again, it's very successful mobile game Honor of Kings, did much better in Southeast Asia compared to anywhere in North America or Europe. I think precisely because it's culturally more similar. But like alternatively, if they weren't bringing the products to these overseas markets, they were also making a lot of investments. And it's like globalization through investment, but they're not really exporting the products to these countries. So the result of that kind of expansion reflects more on their balance sheet than like the brand recognition. So people in the US don't really use WeChat unless they're in the Chinese diaspora community. Yeah, so I think there are different just degrees of expansion depending on how you define it.
So kind of a slightly, shall we say, more nuanced approach between different markets, and a realization that some things work better potentially in emerging markets, potentially in Southeast Asia, than they do in Western markets. Maybe to move forward in time a bit. Obviously, the Ant Financial IPO that was scheduled to take place in 2020 and that was put on hold is often seen as kind of an inflection point in the destinies of these big firms domestically. What impact has it had on their strategies, both obviously in China, but then also in terms of the international aspects of their business?
Right. So at the time when it happened, I think everyone was just shocked. But that turned out to be just the beginning of a series of regulatory clampdown to come in over the next 2 years. So since then, there's been a series of just heightened regulations across the entire consumer internet industry, from gaming to fintech, e-commerce, like music streaming, just everything got tightened up. I think that really dampened VC confidence. Because for a long time, the startups that they invested in were allowed to grow freely and deliver these crazy multiples for the returns. So right now, if you ask around, it's really hard to get VC interest in backing a consumer internet company in China. That said, VCs have fought. So a lot of these companies a lot of these startups find it hard to start to do what Jack Ma and Pony Ma did 10 years ago. But now they are taking the talent, the ideas, the cheap engineering labor, and leverage that and be building products for overseas users. So now you've seen a lot more Chinese entrepreneurs, and because they're slightly younger than the last generation, a lot of them have overseas education background. They feel more confident in the cultural understanding of the West and language. So a lot of them, after seeing that the environment local is quite restricted, a lot of them turn overseas, which is why I kind of also adapted my coverage focus to follow these entrepreneurs abroad. And so as a result, the VCs, the money also follow. So the thesis, one investor told me that the investment thesis has changed from investing in China to investing in Chinese, because Chinese could be anywhere, but still leveraging the talent, the ideas that they've accumulated at home.
So it's had a sort of dampening effect on the domestic sort of fintech or e-commerce startup scene, but at the same time, oddly enough, or conversely, actually the international aspect of these Chinese firms' business is actually oddly more important than it was even before the IPO was put on hold. Moving on, perhaps from the BAT firms, you've talked there a little bit about a new generation of Chinese tech talent. What are some of the new firms that you see coming out of China, and what are the differences in approach that they have towards internationalization in comparison to, say, the previous generation of Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent?
Right. So the two most noticeable companies that have come out of China in the last 5 years is obviously TikTok and Shein. Shein is the fast fashion e-commerce platform. I think compared to their predecessors, they are a lot more localized. The products are not just a straight replicating what's successful in China and bringing it to the West. Shein started only focusing on the international market from day one. TikTok is, to some extent, they tested Douyin. Douyin is the Chinese version of TikTok. It did start in China, but the localization effort in outside of China is just on the next level compared to anything that the BAT has done in the past. And so I think because right now it's not just selling cheap goods, like exporting cheap clothes to the West, but also consumers demand the brand recognition and how you're really integrating into the local culture. And like for TikTok, I think they've done a lot of that. And Shein, I think it's just at the beginning of that. And for a long time, because people forget how long Shein has existed. They started in the late 2000s. So as one of the typical export-oriented e-commerce seller selling cheap fashion to countries around the world. So they've been around for ages, but because they've grown so big, there's a lot more media pressure and regulatory pressure on Shein to become more globalized. So I think it's a mix of like these companies wanted to take more initiative, but also the West is also demanding more from these companies rooted in China to become more localized.
Mm-hmm. So maybe just to wrap up then, I mean, we've talked about several generations here of Chinese firms, particularly focused on their kind of like, shall we say, their approach to internationalization overseas. But what would you see as the big challenge for these firms? Obviously, we're operating in an interesting geopolitical climate at the moment. What advice would you have, or what do you see as the challenges for these firms looking forwards in terms of playing an even more important role internationally?
Right. I think the most daunting challenge for any of the Chinese companies expanding overseas is how they deal with the Chinese identity. Because if you look at TikTok, most of the effort is put in is to try to distance itself from China to become less Chinese because of these geopolitical tensions. But in the process of like decoupling from its home base, it also risks losing some of the advantages of being Chinese. For instance, the great affordable talent pool in China. And if you were to set up an entire team in the US to replicate what its engineering team in Beijing did, it would be a lot more expensive. Like culturally, it's harder for it to manage the people there. And so the question that Chinese companies have to navigate is just like, how do you remain Chinese? How do you hold on to your Chinese identity while still meeting all the compliance requirements and regulatory expectations that you encounter in the West? Okay,
well, thank you. I mean, we could talk about this all day, but I'm aware that we're We're short on time. Thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your insights. And back over to you, Judith.
Thank you so much, Chris Hollifield there and Rita Liao. Now, from China's digital economy, we come round, if you will, full circle to one of the three key topics Minister Bacchus raised earlier in her keynote speech, and that is China's efforts to tackle climate change and decarbonize its economy. Now, at COP27 recently in Egypt, China has reaffirmed its commitment to actively address climate change and pursue, and I quote, a path of ecological priority, green and low carbon development, of course in accordance with China's dual carbon policy. According to a recent report by the World Bank, that means to reach net zero by 2060, China needs between 14 to 17 trillion US dollars in additional investment for green infrastructure and technology in the power and transport sectors alone. So how is China moving forward to mobilize this vast capital needed to facilitate this transition and simultaneously also channel finance into other areas of importance that are related to climate change, such as biodiversity protection? To address all these questions, I have the pleasure to hand you over to our moderator of the final panel for this China Finance Forum 2022, and that is again a familiar face for us, Julie Becker, CEO of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange and founder of the Luxembourg Green Exchange, today the leading and only platform for sustainability dedicated securities and a well-known global voice for sustainable finance. Good to have you with us, Julie. Over to you and your guests.
Thank you very much, Judith, and welcome all to the Green Panel. It's a great honor for me to moderate this discussion between two leading experts on green finance in China, Dr. Yin Hong and Professor Wang Yao. Dr. Yin is Deputy General Director of the Modern Finance Research Institute of the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, and she also serves as Deputy Secretary General of the Green Finance Committee of the China Society for Finance and Banking. And she's Deputy Secretary General of China Modern Financial Society. But more concretely, Dr. Yin is in charge of research on financial theory and practice of commercial banks, green finance, economic circulation and development, to mention only a few topics she covers. Professor Wang is the Director General of the International Institute of Green Finance. She also serves as Deputy Secretary General of the Green Finance Committee of the China Society for Finance and Banking, and as Secretary General of the Green Securities Committee of the Securities Association in China. And in 2019, Professor Wang was granted the Asia Money China Green Finance Award for her outstanding contribution for the development of green finance in China. Dr. Yin, Professor Wang, it's a true pleasure to speak with you today. And over the next 20-25 minutes, we will zoom in on trends and developments shaping the sustainable finance landscape in China and highlight some of the initiatives undertaken by Chinese market participants in this field. So without further ado, I'd like to start by looking at the general policy context in China, starting with you, Professor Wang. China has committed to reaching peak emissions by 2030 and becoming net zero by 2060, as Judith mentioned in introduction. But this, by many, is seen as ambitious goals, given China's size, population, and development needs. And last month, the World Bank indeed published its Country Climate and Development Report on China, which emphasized the essential role that policy will play in driving the green transition in China. And earlier this year, China established also its principles for green bond issuance to standardize national green bond issuance. Which other policy developments would you say has helped accelerate sustainable finance in China? And what more needs to be done, in your view, Professor Wang?
Thank you, Julie. First of all, thanks for creating this great event and inviting me to share my views. And Julie, very nice to see you here. And in fact, we have been cooperating with you since 2017 when we released the first Chinese Green Bond Index together with Shenzhen Stock Exchange. So it was an important step to increase influence of China's green finance interest internationally and attract foreign investors to participate in China's green financial system. But let me get back to your question. I think when talking about China's low carbon transition or sustainable development in general, we must keep in mind that in China, policy making is driven by top-down approach. When it comes to financial sector, I agree that the newly released China Green Bond principles are important measure to narrow the gap between Chinese and international standards. Also, central bank and financial regulators fulfill their role in supporting green transition. We have already seen some of these policies implemented on the ground, but maybe I can give some specific examples. Last year, PBOC, our central bank, launched a carbon emission reduction facility, which is a form of targeted green lending that offers low interest loans to financial institutions that help firms cut carbon emissions. The targeted green lending program will provide 60% of loan principals made by financial institutions for carbon emission cuts at a one-year lending rate of 1.75%. So the PBOC will require financial institutions to publicly disclose information such as low insurance and the amount of financial carbon emission reduction to be verified by third-party institutions for public supervision. So I think this is a great tool that will, a great policy that will promote and incentives development of clean energy, energy conservation, environmental protection, carbon reduction technology, and other relevant key areas, prioritizing projects with biggest potential in carbon emission cuts, reductions. So it will also support banks to develop technical capabilities, such as environmental information disclosure, environmental risk assessment. What more needs to be done? I think, in fact, the carbon neutrality and carbon peak pledge have given a lot of momentum to Chinese low carbon transition, and it very quickly transmitted into other sectoral plans, including financial sector. So it is already a significant breakthrough that, and many market players like banks and enterprises are also very proactive and set their own institutional carbon neutrality plans. So following this top level guidance, other ministries and departments need to release their own sectoral decarbonization policies as soon as possible, so which we called 1+M policy package, so including financial policies. These policies will set the practical pathway for the decarbonization of the Chinese economy in every sector. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang, for this very clear overview from cutting carbon emissions to developing incentive for clean energy or financial policies. Of course, policy development certainly serves to guide the transformation of our societies. But there's one thing I would like also to focus on is the transition finance that will play, I think, an equally important role. Over to you, Dr. Yin, in this context. How is ICBC approaching transition finance? Do you see any new financial products emerging in the field of transition finance? And what type of conversations do you have with clients in this respect?
Thank you, Juliet. I'm very honored to join this panel and share practice of transition finance of financial institutions. As the Ms. Wang mentioned, 1+M policies. Under the guidance and the promotion of 1+M policy for low carbon goal, China's industry structure is developing in a green and low carbon direction, which puts forward new requirements for financial institutions. As a global, systematical, important bank, ICBC actively promotes its own low carbon transition and at the same time supports sustainable transition of the economy and the society. Overall, the following 4 major actions have been taken. One is to build a governance structure. ICBC has established a carbon neutrality working group led by the chairman. Establish a green finance committee headed by the president at the management level, and established a work promotion mechanism in which various departments collaborate, branches actively innovate, and all employees participate. The second is to improve the policy system. The carbon peak and the carbon neutrality work plan of ICBC was issued, clarifying the low carbon transition transformation goals, principle, and the roadmaps. ICBC also issued investments and financing structure, medium and long-term optimization strategy report, which takes low carbon transformation as an important factor in industry investments and financing policy and customer selection standard. The third is to accelerate the innovation of financial products. On the one hand, strengthen the pedigree of green products such as green loan, green bond, green fund, etc. The scale of green credit ranks first among domestic commercial banks. On the other hand, help customers implement low carbon transformation one-on-one with key enterprises to understand the financial needs in the transformation process and use transitional financial instruments such as sustainability-linked bonds to support green transformation enterprises and projects. Fourth, attach importance to research empowerment. Carry out research, the trends and best practices on the stress testing, information disclosure, transition risk, biodiversity protection, finance, etc., and provide policy suggestion and products or tools innovation for the bank. Thank you. This is some practice of ICBC on the transition finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ying, for sharing the ICBC approach to transition finance, a whole program, if I understand, from carbon neutrality to low carbon transformation, the support to green transformation, and going through, of course, disclosures we will have the opportunity to speak about later in our discussion today. But I'd like to take a step back now and look also at transition risks and opportunities in China. Professor Wang, to come back to you, how is China approaching climate transition risks and the opportunities linked to the green transition? Again, according to the World Bank report, China has 4 million jobs in renewable energy today, and this represents half of all jobs in this sector globally. But a lot more jobs would need to be created to compensate for job losses in hard-to-abate sectors. So what policies and initiatives are underway in China to secure a just and fair transition we need that leaves no one behind and that accelerates sustainable development across China? What role will, for instance, public-private partnerships play in tapping into a broader pool of investment?
Okay. At this stage, China is focusing a lot on industrial upgrading and increasing efficiencies. The fact is that China has very coal-dependent energy structure, and the coal is going to be part of the energy mix in the coming years. So the associated job loss is hard to predict. What we see China has been doing is upgrading of the facilities or closing the most inefficient power plants. Yet still, the energy intensity of coal is still relatively high. And what China is planning to do with it is pushing for increased efficiency and promoting the cleaner technologies to create potential for emission savings while keeping jobs. Central bank supports this and launched the targeted re-lending program will provide the 200 billion yuan RMB in total for those safe, efficient, and smart coal mining, coal processing, and clean coal. So national banks will issue loans to eligible projects within the supported areas at a rate basically the same as the primary rate of loans of the same maturity. So People's Bank of China will provide re-lending support to these banks in the equivalent amount of the low principal. Just like Madam Yin shared ICBC's experience, China is also working on the transition finance framework. And just last Saturday, I attended the conference or the annual conference of the Green Finance Committee, where we talked a lot about transition finance, and just transition was highlighted as an important element of the transition finance framework. So this is ongoing work that will probably need more years to be implemented. I also heard about some examples of support for the coal workers implemented on the local level. For example, Longmei group in the Heilongjiang province made arrangements for layoff and transferred coal workers. Employees could be transferred to agriculture area and forestry, municipal and other units with and also in 2016 the Heilongjiang agriculture system alone diverted 4,000 coal workers, and many workers are well employed by local governments. However, now currently there is no such mechanism on the national scale. So we look forward to such a mechanism also well fulfilled in other provinces.
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting example, Professor Wang. Thank you very much. But you're fully right that to ensure this just transition, we need also financial support. And as we are talking about increasing capital flows toward sustainable investment, I think one driver will become more and more important. And you touched upon it, Dr. Yin, as a high complex topic of disclosure. ICBC is a pioneer in this field in China. It is also the first Chinese bank in Europe to establish a dedicated department for sustainability. And Dr. Yin, you lead various industry working groups discussing and defining best practices for disclosures. How are Chinese financial institutions currently approaching environmental information disclosure?
Thank you, Ms. Judith. In terms of environmental risk management, Chinese financial institutions have achieved a lot of practical experience and achievements. The first is to incorporate environmental risk into the comprehensive risk management system and process, strengthen risk analysis of key industries. The second is to make forward-looking prediction about risk. In 2015, ICBC became the first Chinese financial institution to carry out environmental risk stress testing and is leading the compiling work of the standards in risk stress testing. In 2021, the People's Bank of China guided 23 major Chinese commercial banks to complete the first phase of climate stress testing. On the perspective of the information disclosure, there are mainly three characteristics. We will start with pilot case since the end of 2017. Based on the TCFD recommendation framework, the Green Finance Committee of the People's Bank of China and City of London have jointly organized the pilot project on environmental and climate-related information disclosure, which has achieved remarkable results, and the pilot institutions have played an exemplary role. For example, the special topic on green finance TCFD report of ICBC has been successfully released for 4 consecutive years. Together with the annual report and the ESG report, it forms the information disclosure reporting framework of ICBC. The second is the standards specification. In July 2021, the People's Bank of China officially released the guideline for environmental information disclosure by financial institutions, led the drafting by ICBC. At the same time, the operating guideline for commercial banks' environmental information disclosure are also being drafted led by ICBC. The third is research empowerment. This year, the Green Finance Committee established the Environmental Information Disclosure Working Group and organized 8 annual key research projects on global regulatory trends, policy standards, innovative practice, risk management, etc. Among them, the research on transition financial information disclosure of financial institutions led by ICBC was released on November 6 at the China International Import-Expo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yin. And congratulations on all these achievements for disclosures and transparency. I believe this transparency is essential as it allows investors to make informed investment decisions and invest according to their values and their own convictions. Now shifting gears, I'd like also to move over to a different and the final topic of our discussion, which is associated to a deep sense of urgency: biodiversity. Biodiversity is essential for the processes that support all life on Earth, including humans. And to quote David Attenborough, if we take care of nature, nature will take care of us. And this is not only about saving our planet, it's about saving ourselves. And the truth is that with or without us, the natural world will rebuild. So in this context, earlier this month, an agreement was signed between China, the European Union, and France, in which the European Union and France committed to providing financing and technical assistance to institutions in China in the field of environmental protection and preservation of biodiversity. And last year, during the Convention on Biological Diversity, President Xi Jinping announced the Kunming Biodiversity Fund for the protection of fauna and flora in developing countries. So starting with you, Professor Wang, how is this focus on biodiversity being reflected in green finance in China today? And what can other countries learn from China in this respect?
Thank you, Julie, for this question. I agree that there is an increased focus on biodiversity finance in the recent months. last September, PBOC published a study on biodiversity finance, which is a clear indication that central bank is already taking biodiversity conservation into consideration. So the report acknowledges that biodiversity loss will cause physical and transition risks to the financial industry. The first sentence of this report is a straightforward acknowledgement of the main conclusion of the NGFS report study on biodiversity and financial stability. Another influential research is ongoing as well. In the beginning of 2022, the Green Finance Committee has initiated a very comprehensive study on different aspects of biodiversity finance with 11 thematic working subgroups. Our institute, IIGF, is also part of these efforts, leading the research on the corporate biodiversity related information disclosure. And PBOC now is also one of the founding organizations of the NGFS that launched the study on biodiversity and financial stability last year. At the same time, Chinese local governments are also cooperating with the UNDP on the implementation of the BIFIN project in China, is a biodiversity project. As for now, we have established 2 pilot projects in the city of Shanghai and Shandong province. And so the project aims to establish financing mechanisms that will open new financing channels for the biodiversity conservation that might be later scaled up to the national context. So there's quite a lot happening on the research front. When it comes to product innovation, Chinese financial institutions have started experimentation. I think later Madam Ying will also share ICBC's experience. But I think more efforts are needed on this in the future. Also, when it comes to biodiversity related standards and policies, current green financial policy is to certain extent including the biodiversity considerations. However, more specific guidance and more detailed standards need to be developed in the future. Except the comprehensive related research, what I think is worth learning from China is the innovating approach to economic accounting that is pioneered by China, the growth ecosystem product, GEP accounting. It is a new way of including the value provided by nature and the ecosystem services into the economic accounting, and also I think for the financial market. So I think China is a global leader in the implementation of this idea. Just recently, the Ministry of Finance, MOF, released guidelines promoting environmental protection and decarbonization and the GEP accounting as explicit components of fiscal rewards and the punishment system in Shenzhen. So this is a breakthrough on a global scale, and it shows a big rethinking of how economic value is accounted. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Wang. Maybe in 1 minute, Dr. Yin, do you have anything to add to what Professor Wang just explained about biodiversity?
Yeah, thank you. I also, from the financial institutions perspective, I think there are 3 practices in the field are worth sharing. First, strictly adhere to the red line of ecological protection. It's very important. For example, since 2015, ICBC has incorporated the promotion of biodiversity into the group's green credit development strategy. They resolutely implement the Wang vote veto system for environmental protection in industry with high biodiversity risk to prevent the above industry from affecting important habitat and ecological destruction of ecosystem in fragile area. Second is to increase credit extension in the field of biodiversity. Support biodiversity-friendly customers and projects. For example, as of the end of June, ICBC's Houze branch in the Green Finance Reform pilot zone has invested 6 billion yuan in financing for key area of biodiversity protection and has supported more than 20 projects. The third is to carry out forward-looking research on biodiversity financing. Under the guidance of the Research Institute of the Head Office, ICB's Houze branch joined the financial support for biodiversity research group of the China GFC, focusing on the three goals to carry out the pilot trials of biodiversity finance. This is some practice about biodiversity practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Yin, Professor Wang, it's time to conclude. Thank you so much for taking part in this event and for sharing the in-depth insights and unique perspectives that you have gained in the course of your impressive careers. It was a pleasure talking to you today and learning more about some of the topics that are shaping green finance and more broadly, the green transition in China. Thank you very much. Back to Judith now in the studio.
Thank you so much, Julie Becker there and her panel guests, Professor Wang and Dr. Yin. And it is indeed encouraging to hear about the determination with which the Chinese government and the financial sector players are determined to tackle and combating climate change and also address issues such as biodiversity protection. Now, this concludes the China Finance Forum 2022. I hope the insights provided by our experts have been interesting and indeed useful to you to operate in a certainly at the moment a challenging and changing environment that nonetheless offers great opportunities going forward. And I also hope indeed that it provides for a better understanding, in the words of Dr. Bergsten earlier, between Europe and China and the US. Also, as Minister Bacchus said at the outset in her keynote today, dialogue with China is essential to work out those collective solutions for the key issues our world is facing, chiefly, in her words, achieving sustainable growth for the global economy, de-escalating the war in Ukraine, and of course combating climate change. So it remains for me to express our gratitude to all our speakers who contributed with their wisdom, experience and knowledge, to our sponsors and our media partner, the Financial Times, and to all of you who have been joining us from around the world. Also, heartfelt gratitude goes out to the team at Luxembourg for Finance and to the team here at the European Broadcasting Centre, who have, as always, collaborated beautifully to put on this professional format. For me, it's also been a pleasure and a privilege to be with all of you today. Thank you very much. Goodbye. 谢谢. 再见.